Hello and welcome back to Week in Review with Doooovid. Sorry about the late start this evening. That's on me. I was just so interested in this debate that took place recently about whether science was supported by atheism or theism. So my subconscious must have distracted me and led me to believe that the show normally started at 8, even though I should have known it started at 7. So here we are, either 54 minutes later, 6 minutes early, depending on how you want to look at it. But thanks everyone for joining. Looking forward to the show, and I'll hand it over to you, Doovid, for the introductions. Thanks for being here with us this Sunday evening. I think you're still muted.
Okay, great. Hope everyone had a good week. And I don't have too many things to share this week, but I'll just share real quick so we didn't read my blog post on Ahimsa last week. If you want to read that this week, we can. It's my most successful post yet. It's got over 210 hearts and over 6,000 unique views on the chess server. So getting picked up on the chess server. I'm not sure if I got 600 views, almost 700 Kotov and cognitive dissonance. So getting a little picked up on the chess server. So if you want to examine that,
you figure it's a spillover. You figure it's a spillover from the 6,000 plus strong Ahimsa post.
Well, I had already had over 400 on my cognitive dissonance and Kotov, but it was slowing down. So yeah, probably 100, maybe 200 people looked at it, probably because they saw the Ahimsa post and from there clicked on to some of the other ones. But just look at this. Oh, sorry. Just check this real quick. Although I think my Science of Consciousness post that may not have got too many more views. So even my 3D printing's over 300 views. The Frankfurt School, 300 views. Science of Consciousness conference only had 165 views. And actually the one that has to do with chess, only 300 views. So maybe people just clicked on the most recent of my blog articles, or however that works. But yeah, I thought the Ahimsa was definitely one of my better blog posts yet, and it's an interesting topic. So hopefully we'll have a chance to look at that. Friday had Daniel of Active Inference on my channel. I thought it was going to be at 4, but it ended up at 1, a time zone issue. But we had a nice conversation. He gave a long bio. I still haven't time-stamped it, so hopefully I'll get to doing that. But check that out, and we'll see. Maybe you'll be collaborating more with Active Inference. This is just in the Jerusalem Post, but you can see it in any periodical. The alignment of Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn for another week. So hasn't been this case for over 150 years. The alignment of 5 of the planets. So any astronomy geeks out there, check that out. Others still can. Active Inference has going to have Stephen Grossberg on Tuesday morning. So definitely going to check that out. Hopefully I'll be live in the chat, 10 a.m. And Stephen Grossberg, Boston University, resident mind, author of the book Conscious Mind, Resonant Brain, like a textbook on neuroanatomy. So that's a big interview. I think he's reasonably advanced in age, in his 70s. So we look forward to that. And as I mentioned, the Science of Consciousness conference, competitively, probably Carl Friston and the Predictive Mind is probably the main school. and then after that, Grossberg and resonant mind of main theories, and even quantum mind uh, probably has less actual predictive power or explanatory power
Well,
than.
it's more of metaphysics. So the way I would put it is that like metaphysics can have predictions, but you have to interpret it. So metaphysics as such doesn't give predictions definitionally because of what it is. But then if you interpret it to the point where it becomes more than what it originally was, then yeah, you could say it makes predictions. Saying very little, it's saying more than quantum fields, which may or may not be, emphasis on may, self-contradictory. But I'll put that to the side and hand it back over to you.
Yeah, I mean, it's saying something different, and what it's saying may be smaller in terms of the quest of consciousness, than just how the brain itself works. So, I mean, although the Penrose Hameroff, has to do with how the brain works, but that's just one element of the neural function and the micro tubules. But the relative neural circuits in general, we consider more, I don't know, important is the right word, but more central to consciousness processes than just the microtubules, even if the microtubules facilitate.
Well, even though he's saying it's materialist, it's essentially a different paradigm, and it appears to be saying that the microtubule matrix generates a superposition.
Yeah, I'm saying it's important, but it's only one piece in the consciousness puzzle, and the predictive brain and resonant brain are probably more central because it deals with the larger brain and neuroanatomy, not just microtubules.
I mean, frankly, I think the surprise minimizing says more on an information accessible through language level, thereby rendering it more useful through that alone.
And possibly, you don't have to debate it, but it was just saying that even if it you made progress and demonstrated results from the microtubules, that the functioning of the whole brain and the neural circuits would still be a large piece in the puzzle, if not a larger piece in the puzzle. So here, I've shared this many times, more video of the Evan Hapia, which means the cornerstone laying ceremony for Baba Yeshiva, sponsored by Levi Sharf. Tens of millions of dollars to be one of the largest synagogues in Brooklyn, and they devised uh, like a trap so that the grand rabbi could pour the the cement, liquid cement, down, and it would go to the cornerstone, which was many stories underground, and so I had a big ceremony. So there's been a lot of delays, and they were purchasing more buildings and to get like the whole block, and so they finally broken ground. And this video of the whole uh, part of the ceremony. They closed off the streets in Brooklyn, and on the streets, and there was chanting. So we're going to talk about this probably quite a bit, might even be a good portion of the show. The debate between T Jump and JF on the same team against Sal and Perspective Philosophy on, is science more compatible with atheism or theism? So I just have one more link to share: the new MIT course on real analysis. So this is looks like a pretty good course, a lot of deep mathematics. So, and it looks like it wasn't taught in front of a class. It was like just recorded, and it has number theory, statistical analysis, um, Riemann Taylor theory, power series, different things. So check that out. And it looks like they finally, whatever reason was the holdup, that they opened up the machine vision course also, that whatever reason it was on, and then they hit it, and now it's back on. So the machine vision, I haven't had a chance to look at either one of those. I've been focusing mostly on active inference. I'm almost caught up. I'm on lecture like 40 of this current last one was 46. So that is all the stuff I had to share this week. Not that much. So that's my week in review. So hopefully we could look at my ahimsa essay, and we'll talk about the T-jump and kind of the epistemology of science, and anything Jennifer has prepared, and maybe a little bit more about active inference and the free energy principle, and just what's coming from that angle, or streaming, getting involved with them, what that means, if anything at all.
Yeah, that's great. So it sounds like you've been putting a lot of time into watching these active inference videos.
Yeah, I've been reading the papers too. So I read, like over 40 papers. I mean, in two speed, and while I'm doing other things, but and so over 100 videos I've watched already, and a lot of them are long, like 2 hours. So if by the time I catch up, it'll be like 200 hours of videos I've watched from them.
Has it been pretty much the same throughout, or has there been a direction of evolution in the work?
Um, well, most of the papers aren't like fresh or new. So I mean, it's basically the style where they have 3 videos, a first video covering, explaining a paper, and then another 2 videos discussing it. And then they also have uh, special guest interviews. Sometimes the authors of the paper will participate in the panels. So it's unclear, like if there's like some direction or some culmination to it. It's just kind of like
So
week
it's
in
basically
review.
whatever the authors know about the topic. It's just them talking about their research, not going into the actual ideas or anything. No, I mean, no offense intended.
Well, I mean, they go into the ideas, they talk about it, and usually the authors don't participate. In the minority, do they actually get the authors? But in terms of like, I mean, I guess you call it like a group or public research work group, and but they're covering modern, scientific papers, usually written in the last few years. How interesting it'd be to or what people would get out of it. But for me, it was interesting because to get into the feel of these scientific papers, to get my mind working, and because I think that the free energy principle, active inference, the Bayesian mechanics is likely very similar to what I'm going to use for my multiple truth hypothesis. So, in search of a mathematical uh, algorithm for my multiple truth hypothesis, it's likely to be very similar to the active inference algorithm.
Well, it just looks like, not just, but it sounds like a model for the cognitive process. And that it contains 2 main components, which would be the epistemological component and the utilitarian component, I believe is how he worded it. Has that been the theme throughout? Like, does he keep mentioning that exact same sort of thing, or is it?
I'm not sure there is a theme throughout. They really just facilitated discussions on papers. And although, a lot of them center around, or even the majority center around active inference and the free energy principle, that there's not necessarily like a running theme. It just, besides like maybe comparable to like Wolfram's working study groups.
His study groups are going over his own projects, though. Like it's basically people that, as far as I understand, work under him talking about their work and making sure he's brought up to speed on what exactly it is that they're doing. And it does seem as though they've, in a large way, worked on stuff he's kind of come up with. Although, I mean, I'm not too sure, honestly.
Yeah, I mean, so like the framework of active inference and the free energy principle is, is developed by Carl Friston, is now open and applicable to anybody, and hundreds of papers have been written on the subject. So just going over these papers and how Daniel and the active inference lab came to be, and if they're directly researching on behalf of Carl Friston, it doesn't appear so, although he may be like supervisory, have an advisory role. So it's not quite the same as Stephen Wolfram, but I'm saying it's active study sessions in terms of people who've written scientific papers on applications of the free energy principle. And, some of them are similar topics, but, the framework is applicable to countless fields, and even the cognitive sciences that there's countless fields. So yeah, I don't know how many papers. I mean, he mentioned Carl Friston's one of the single most quoted scientific papers ever. So I mean, it could be they have a near endless supply if they go over like one paper a month, or that they'll have a near endless supply, and for them that just that the free energy principle is being written about and published about so often that so I'm not sure. I mean, people could watch my interview with Daniel to see what exactly they think they're accomplishing, or if they think like they're on the verge of some breakthrough, or saying that the free energy principle, active inference has been advanced, and now people are using it in the same way that I could publish. If I published on the multiple truth hypothesis, I might directly quote the free and principle and Friston's work, and say that I adapted my truth discovery algorithm from his formulation. And so those are the type. I mean, most of the people are the papers are PhDs and mainstream scientists, but that's the type things that are being advanced, mostly towards issues of neuroscience or psychology, cognition, some social science.
Well, I mean, I don't know what. It's unclear why you'd want to draw on this model in particular. It's one implementation of. I mean, I can't see this working with your thing, because your thing is a metaphysical principle, and you'd have to make it. I mean, this is like one particular model, even if it is a general principle that it's actually alluding to, and I would say that the surprise minimization to a large extent is quite general. The way that it's formulated is not.
Well, I would more generalize the mathematics, the algorithm to so if he's focusing on cognition and perception, that it is saying that the algorithm would look similar. And so I had drawn upon chess engines and computer software, computer algorithms, but it could be that this free energy principle algorithm is more developed than these um, machine learning algorithms, even though they're similar.
Well, you mean result facing or theory facing?
They're both, I guess, would be a form of Bayesian mechanics.
I mean, are you going to go with what's result facing or theory facing? Because some stuff has tons of results, like AI has tons of results, but is the theory well understood? No. And some theories are very well developed with less demonstrations on the same sort of class of demonstrations is what you'd point to for success, justifying the success of AI. There's a question in the chat about the relationship between free energy principle, multiple truth hypothesis, and adaptive inference. Like I can put it over YouTube, but I can say like free energy is a very general thing, and you could say that it bridges metaphysics and physics because it operates both as a ground up or sort of basic reasoning principle, but it also can be said to predict physical configurations, which would make it also a physical principle. So if you want to go into that, question's probably better suited for you to answer.
Yeah, I mean, the similarity is just in the structure of the Bayesian mechanics, that it would be a truth discovery function that would return a value between 0 and 1.
Like physics isn't Bayesian, you got to understand that. There's
Uh,
nothing Bayesian about physics.
well, it is because the
It's
solution.
really not. Physics has no concept of what you call prior odds, which is
It
core
does.
to the
That,
Bayesian
and the
reasoning
reality
process.
is that most physics uses statistical methods to solve.
Statistics, yes. Bayesian, no.
Um,
The
yeah, I mean, it could be
statistical
that.
approach in physics is called a superposition of eigenstates, of particular states more generically. This may be explainable in that paradigm of Bayesian statistics, but I don't see where. Or I don't see that as being extant theorem.
Well, I mean, the similarity would be just in the structure of the algorithm, that it would return a value between 0 and 1 based on priors and feedback from the environment. That whatever, the multiple truth, the theory that was being tested, would have some sort of priors and a feedback mechanism that would go into some sort of Bayesian equation and return a value between 0 and 1. And so that sense, it would be like the active inference equations.
So you want to use the Bayesian thing because it fits with what
It
you
would also be like the
what your
physics
theory is.
equations or Schrodinger's equations.
So it sounds like your theory is the true false is like a true false sort of system.
Well, I'd have a algorithm um, equation form where if you could mathematize a proposition, you would be able to plug it into the algorithm, and then something like machine learning, maybe you feed information into it and then test it within the environment, and then it would self-correct itself with the observational data.
Yeah,
And
so I guess I would say the issue is that the priors, the manner in which the priors are being adapted biases the sample in a manner that makes the new resulting data and the bias one result. So that's sort of the challenge, is
well, wouldn't
distinguishing those
necessitate. I
two
mean,
factors.
you could have priors or not. You could just have uh you could just immediately, without priors, you could just go to the sensory perception, the testing of observational data. I mean, it'd be like machine learning, where you could train it or you could not train it. Some of the equation would be neutral in that form, where you could feed in training data, or you could not. And if that biases it, or however, would have to be accounted for in the ultimate truth value, or noted if you had the difference between. But just in terms of Bayesian mechanics, whether you fed in priors or not, it would still return a value, a self-correcting value between 0 and 1 based on observational data. And so in that sense, it would be of the similar format to the active inference to the free energy principle.
I don't see how that's connected to the free energy principle.
It's
What's
not.
the free
The
energy?
equations would have the same structure form.
Well, it sounds like you're basically saying it's an optimization problem.
The truth discovery function is. So for the multiple truth hypothesis, you're saying it's not just cultural, it's not just truth relativism. There's, some truths are more, so to say, true than others. And so there would be a connected truth discovery function that would return a value between 0 and 1 if there was a grand theory of the multiple truth hypothesis. It would be the sum total of all truth statements times their truth value equals 1, similar to the Schrodinger wave equation.
Okay.
And then if there was an actual method to feed in, if someone could parameterize um, axioms to a truth that would make it testable, then it could actually be ran. And
Just because you can parameterize axioms to an assertion doesn't mean it's testable. Like you're
would
saying
be
you can
testable
simulate it.
would be testable, simulated with observable data.
Okay.
So it'd be what exactly type truth claims are being made, and then what type of observable data would be available to assess at a truth value, which is in essence what the free energy principle is doing.
The free energy principle is a physical principle. And it's saying that specifically a system will evolve in one way only, and namely in a manner that minimizes the free energy. And then it's just a question of how accurately one describes the free energy, the degree to which the model is actually saying anything. So it's sort of vague. So what free energy means for your MTH sort of depends where it's inserted in the reasoning. You can't just
It's
say,
not,
well, it's
my
whenever.
case isn't going to include free energy. It's just going to have the structure of the equation is going to be very similar.
Okay. Structure of the
That's,
equation.
or I even prefer to call it algorithm than to an equation.
Yeah. So it's a process. Algorithms are processes.
So it'd be more a more generalized form of the free energy of principal equations, and saying that's not the only place where those equations exist. And so I've been mentioning the machine learning and truth discovery functions, which
It's
have a
free energy.
similar structure to the free energy principle in general. Those equations.
Rick DeWitt is asking, is free energy the same as least action? Well, there's the least action principle, and then there's free energy that's understood to be minimized, which is what the least action principle is. So the least action principle has some, I guess, mathematical baggage as to what constitutes a path, but it's essentially connected conceptually. Now, this isn't too much connected to what I understand from this conceptual model about surprise minimization, that they're saying in particular there's sort of maybe two things, epistemological and utilitarian motives. I'm probably butchering it, but I'm still sort of getting to understanding it. I think maybe the fact that entropy is in the equation is why they think it's a minimization of least action, like some sort of curve fitting going on in there. So I'm not even sure myself. Do you know why?
Why what?
Why they're calling it a well, what are they calling it? Least action? Yeah. I mean,
Look,
the model's not called surprise minimization, right? Anyway,
well, that's a generalized. Some of these formulas are generalized. That there's many formulas that have the same generalized form. If it's the Shannon information or game theory, free energy principle, truth discovery functions, uh, some forms of physics, I would say they have this generalized form of an equation where you have the entropy and so to say the surprise factor.
do you want to look at your blog post?
Sure, I'm not even sure if I have to look the free energy principle. I'm sorry, the least action principle, and we went over that. It's to the formulation of the stationary action principle. That I mean, the least action principle comes out of philosophy to the equation form of the stationary action principle, which or Marapetis's principle, which doesn't have the entropy in this surprise form, versus um, I guess is it the Boltzmann entropy formula where S equals KB times log W.
Yeah, that's the generic, like microstates equivalence of entropy.
Some of these equation forms have, so that's what I was talking about in terms of just the structure of the equation. That so it's a free energy has an entropy and a surprise factor, and it has the logarithmic form of the entropy equations. And so I'm not sure if the formulation of the multiple truth hypothesis, whether I'd have an entropy in a logarithmic term, and then so the active inference equations don't necessarily have the logarithmic form, and then I guess the stationary action principle is based on a Lagrangian. Most of the machine learning, the truth discovery functions like Shannon information uh, equations have the entropy in the logarithmic form. So, I'm still researching in just the likelihood that the equations would have that structure, and then if you understand the structure of these equations and why what the mathematical language means to the understanding, and maybe we'll return to this when we talk back to the JFT jump debate on does theism or atheism uh, provide a better framework for science?
Yeah. Um, I'm looking forward to that. I've got it up here. It says active inference is the first principles approach to understanding behavior in the brain, framed in terms of a single imperative to minimize free energy. Okay. Well, if that's what it is, then okay. What he was talking about was quite a bit more specific than that. But, well, I mean, what we talked about on the last show is quite a bit more specific. But yeah, that's cool. Generic principles are good to have. because then you have emergent reasoning. And if there's a problem in your emergent reasoning, you can backtrace to your fundamental principle and say, oh, this is where I interpreted it wrong, rather than having to, it's unclear what else you could do really to correct a misapprehension. But yeah, I'd like to help, but I'm not sure, like, what are they doing with the research, or are they just doing research? Because it's kind of like, if it's just research, I'm not sure what I can really contribute.
Well, I think it's just a collective to get together and that I mean, the active inference lab is I guess it's just like a web page in a stream that it's an organization that doesn't even have a I mean, it's kind of just like we can review it. It's not really anything that I mean, if you're in their Discord, you could fill out a form, you could register, uh, but what exactly do they do? It's just a collective of people researching similar topics. And so they have their live stream, which focuses on reviewing papers of people who've actually written scientific papers on the topic. And, so really that's it. That's all it is. And it's not necessarily that, saying that free energy principle doesn't even include the term consciousness because it's, I guess consciousness is a loaded term. So it's, focusing on cognition, perception, neurology, and it's skirting the consciousness question. So you getting involved, I don't know if it doesn't really mean anything.
Well, if it's talking about behavior, I
it's
struggle
just
to
a
see how
network.
behavior is not connected to consciousness.
Well, because consciousness is a loaded term that for whatever reason they've chose not to include.
It's a loaded term, right? But they've included behavior. How's that not just as loaded?
Well, I mean, because probably consciousness has the dualistic intentions, and consciousness is much more likely to be eliminated. That I don't know if there's the eliminativist school of behavior, and that but and even he's
That
saying that
doesn't really say anything. I don't understand what that means. Like,
consciousness is hard to define, and is more controversial, even whether it exists at all, and if it does exist, what it is. And so it's been simpler for them to.
so behavior is less specific, or wait, behavior is less problematic than consciousness? Is that it?
Behavior is much more easy to define and have meaning.
Well, to me, it's way harder because people can lie about their intentions if you're focused on behavior and not if you're focused on consciousness. So I'm still completely lost as to where the boundary is.
That's what we talked about the two streams I was on, the BDI model of beliefs, desires, and intentions. And like questions of like free will and whether even intentions exist. So if these concepts of consciousness uh, are unclear whether they have a scientific parallel. So to just focus on behavior like psychometrics, behavior is a measurable thing. There's no scientific way to measure intentions. You can't even rely on psychometric data. You have to rely on reported introspection. So you can have introspection.
Uh,
So you can't even psychometrically measure intention. You can only take the word of a person of introspection where I introspect to determine my own intentions and then give it over to for research. But so it's kind of a dead end on research. So it's so I'm guessing that's why they're skirting the consciousness question. And that's kind of like
it's
I
a
have
dead end
no.
on research because it's too vague.
No, because it's not. it's based on introspection. It's a product of mind.
Um,
It can't be
it's
measured
product of mind.
independently
Therefore, it's biased. Is that the argument? It's biased because it's subjective.
because yeah, it can't be
Is that the idea?
measured independently of mind. Behavior could be measured independently of mind.
Huh.
We've been in these circles 100 times, and every time, like, I'm not sure if what your hang
Well,
up was.
we disagree as to what a fallacy is, and that's fine.
Well, I'm saying a fallacy, but just saying that
It's no problem. I don't want to argue about like you said. We've
I'm
been
not
in circles so
saying
many
a
times.
fallacy. I'm just talking about measurement and measurement of things that are independent of mind. And if you want to say it's impossible or much more difficult to measure things that are dependent on mind, so something intentions are clearly mind dependent, as
Uh-huh.
opposed to behavior. Um, behavior itself may or may not be mind dependent, but the measurement of behavior is not mind dependent, as opposed to intention. The measurement of intention is mind dependent. There's no mind independent way to measure intention.
It's a bit hard to talk about because there's a couple things going on. There's like, what's the most unbiased measurement? What does it mean for a measurement to be unbiased? Is there such a thing as a completely unbiased measurement? Which is,
I didn't use the word bias, but if you wanted to, and you're saying mind dependent means biased, but
no, I think
I
it's a
didn't
bit
even
ill.
draw that. I'm
No,
just
I'm
saying that
trying to point to why the
intention
ill
cannot be
code.
measured independently of mind, as opposed to behavior can be measured independently of mind. So if you want to add in a bias in this, like, because intention could only be measured dependent on mind, it's more biased. You could say that, but it's not necessary. And it's saying that's why if you say the active inference is focusing on mind independent measurable aspects, things that could be measured independently of mind.
Okay. It just seems like if you're presuming you can do that, then you're not going to correct for possible bias or artifacting or something like that. Kind of assuming that it's possible to be mind independent. And so I think it should be reframed as what is the most objective perspective? What is the most unbiased perspective? Which is what brings us, we'll eventually get to the debate. I don't know if you want to go to the debate first or your article first.
Yeah, maybe might as well go to the article, because we're probably just going to get in one of these circles, and it's really we need the multiple truth hypothesis where Jennifer.
We don't agree, and I'm fine with us not agreeing.
Well,
And
I'm
it's
saying
good
if
that
you're
maybe it's good
insisting
that we
on
don't agree.
disagreeing because you're insisting on promoting your own perspective, as opposed
You're
to
saying it's possible to have mind independent things. I'm saying it's not. We disagree as to what
well, it's like
constitutes
it's a school.
fallacy, and that's
I
fine.
mean, okay, you disagree that's such a thing, but it's saying I was just explaining why they set it up in the way that they did. So you're like, well, they're wrong. And it's saying, well, according to your perspective, I know according to your perspective, you're not adding anything new by but reasserting your own perspective, as opposed to what I said was very clear of the reason why they set it up. So you're just saying, well, their perspective contradicts your perspective, and then it's just like a circle of repeating where you can't get outside of yourself, where every single time it contradicts your perspective, you just say, well, they're wrong, and it gets into this repetitive loop because you can't talk about things outside of your own perspective.
Nobody can.
I mean, possibly. I mean, theoretically, that's another uh, claim that you're making that may or may not be true.
Here's another claim, Rick. There's no neural net. That's something that was constructed in the computer. That doesn't mean it's somehow connected to the brain. However, I do think there's value in emulating biological stuff, like bioemulation. I don't know what you want to call it, in technology. I think that is awesome. I think that's a good place to go in terms of perspectives. But yeah, so I feel like what I'm saying is new, but maybe it sounds always the same. But
Because
it's
you're just
like
repeating
there's
the
a limit to
assertion of your own
understanding.
perspective.
If we want to get past the limit to
I know your
understanding,
perspective. I
we
don't need
have
you
to
to
go to
you
where the
assert your own
limits of the
perspective.
understandings are.
I don't need to be reminded that your perspective is in opposition to a certain perspective that we're referring to. That's
Even
why
if
it's
it's the
repetitive.
direction to go in to
That's why I
correct
said
the errors that are in it right
we're
now.
talking about a different theory, and whether or not that is contradictory or how that fits in with your perspective and may be interesting to talk about. But in terms like, no, you got to step outside of yourself and say, we're just talking about someone else's theory, not your own. Don't be Claire. We're not talking about you. It's not about you.
I
We're
don't
talking about
see
a
my
different
theory
theory
as uniquely
that's
mind
based on
dependent.
different axioms than yours.
In my view, every theory is mind dependent, just a matter of
I
how.
know that that's your view. So if that means
Right.
that any theory that has a different axiom is not worth talking about with you, then so be it.
Well, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying, can we reframe it so that it is actually mind dependent rather than independent?
Probably not. And that's
Well,
why
we
you
can't.
was getting these in these loops.
Of
So
course,
because
we
you
can
just can't
reframe something as
you
mind
can't work
dependent.
with these axioms that contradict your own understanding.
I can work with them just fine. It's just a question of getting information. Do you want to proceed to try to get information out of something that you can't get information out of, or what? But it's fine. I mean, do you want me to read your I can start reading your article.
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
One of the central Okay, let me just see here. My screen share is cutting off the actual name of it. Okay, so it is called the Ahimsa Principle. First paragraph is a lesson in life. One of the central, you put tenets, it's tenets, I think. The word is tenets. One of the central tenets that guides my life is the Ahimsa Principle. The Ahimsa Principle comes from the Dharmic religions arising from India, namely Jainism, Buddhism, and Hinduism. Ahimsa is mentioned in some of the earliest texts known to man. Ahimsa means without harm. In Sanskrit, the A at the beginning of a word is a negation, and himsa means harm or violence. This is similar to the Hebrew word Hamas in the Bible, which also means violence. Genesis 6:11. The simplest understanding of the Ahimsa principle means a life free of violence. In Dharmic philosophy, ahimsa is not only a moral principle, but a central theological concept of the functioning of the material and spiritual worlds and the purpose of life. In this essay, I will trace the origins of the ahimsa principle from first mentions in Vedic texts to widespread applications today in the modern world. I'll also examine some of the larger philosophical implications of the ahimsa principle related to karma. I'm just going to mute you because I can hear it coming through a little bit. Sorry. The self-improvement process and an outlook for understanding the meaning of life. The earliest Vedic texts, such as Rig Veda, Manu Smriti, Dharma Shastras, and more, include ahimsa as a central tenet and moral precept I think you probably meant to put live by, but you put life by. Manu Smriti includes ahimsa as the first of 5 restraints. Yama for personal behavior, among truthfulness, satyam, non-stealing or coveting, asyam, purity of mind and body, saucham, and control of senses, indriyan nigraha. Manusmriti 1063. Himsa is singled out as a precept applicable to all people, regardless of caste. Almost all the Dharmic texts names the Himsa as one of the most important principles, as in the famous statement in the Mahabharata 117:37, Ahimsa Paramo Dharma. Ahimsa is the highest moral virtue. The Bhagavad Gita mentions Ahimsa 4 times in lists of essential character traits. In Buddhism, Ahimsa is the first of the 5 precepts all Buddhists are expected to live by. On a basic level, ahimsa is understood as the reason for vegetarianism. as the ahimsa principle applies to all of creation, fellow humans, animals, and the environment, prohibiting killing animals for meat due to unnecessary harm. Ahimsa also serves as a general guideline for all decisions in life, with a general standard of minimization of harm to be factored into all actions. The concept of ahimsa is most central and detailed in the Jain religion, not only being the main moral precept to live by, but a fundamental principle of creation. How am I sounding?
Fine. I'm just making those edits. I'm going to change the tenets and that live by.
Awesome. Before turning to Jainism, let's look at the role of the Ahimsa principle in Krishna consciousness. In Krishna consciousness, bhakti, love or devotion, is the main principle, but Ahimsa is still an important principle. Clearly mentioned 4 times in the Gita as lists of main tenets. The Srimad Bhagavatam 4:22-24 states a candidate for spiritual advancement must be nonviolent, must follow in the footsteps of the great acharyas, sages, must always remember the pastimes of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, must follow the regulative principles without material desire, and while following the regulative principles, should not blaspheme others. A devotee should lead a very simple life and not be disturbed by the duality of opposing elements. He should learn to tolerate them. Srila Prabhupada, in his commentary on this verse, Srimad Bhagavatam, writes, the devotees are actually saintly persons or sadhus. The first qualification of a sadhu or devotee is ahimsa, or nonviolence. Persons interested in the path of devotional service or in going back home, back to Godhead, must first practice ahimsa, or nonviolence. A devotee should be tolerant and should be very much compassionate towards others. For example, if he suffers personal injury, he should tolerate it. But if someone else suffers injury, the devotee need not tolerate it. The whole world is full of violence, and a devotee's first business is to stop the violence, including the unnecessary slaughter of animals. A devotee is the friend not only of human society, but of all living entities. For he sees all living entities as sons of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. He does not claim himself to be the only Son of God and allow all others to be killed, thinking that they have no soul. This kind of philosophy is never advocated by a pure devotee of the Lord. Shrudasarva Deninam. A true devotee is the friend of all living entities. This is called ahimsa. Such nonviolence can be practiced only when we follow in the footsteps of the great acharyas. We'll examine soon the role of violence in Srila Prabhupada's dispute with Gandhi over pacifism and the true meaning of ahimsa. But clearly ahimsa is of primal importance in Krishna consciousness. Devotees of Krishna focus on bhakti, love of God, seeing ahimsa as a derivative principle to bhakti. This path of speculative knowledge and renunciation is not essential for devotional service. Indeed, good qualities such as nonviolence and control of the mind and senses automatically accompany a devotee of Lord Krishna. Sri Chaitanya Charitam Rita Madhya Leela 22:145. But the concept of ahimsa is clear as a primary directive and meaning behind Shrudasarva Dehinam, meaning a devotee is the friend to all living entities. However, in Krishna consciousness, ahimsa is to be achieved through bhakti, love and devotion, not austerities as in Jainism. Although the theological connection between karma and ahimsa is largely the same, only different in focus and method. The ahimsa principle is most fully developed in the teachings of Jainism, being the fundamental principle of the Jain religion. People might be familiar with Jain monks sweeping the path before them to make sure not to kill any insects. But within Jainism, the ahimsa principle is not merely a fundamental moral precept to live by, but a theological concept that helps explain the purpose of creation, origins and destination of the soul, and the inner workings of the spiritual and material realms. As in most Dharmic traditions, Jains believe in karma, action-reaction, result of all past and present activities, samsara, cycle of birth and death, moksha, release from samsara, and varnashrama, duties and stages of life. And deeper understandings of the soul and karma center on the ahimsa principle. The jiva is the formless eternal soul, and ajiva, the temporary living material form. And karma is the dust that covers and weighs down the jiva into samsara, preventing moksha. Violation of the ahimsa principle causes the accumulation of bad karma. Following the ahimsa principle is the main method of not accumulating bad karma. All right, did you want to take over for a bit there? I'm a bit my voice is getting a bit tired.
Okay, I edited that, God forbid, to tenant, like a landlord. So I changed that to tenant. Appreciate that. In classical Jain text expositions of explanations, there are 8 types of karma, 4 harming and 4 non-harming. The 4 harming types of karma are delusory, attachment to incorrect views, knowledge obscuring, interfering with body, with both intellect and senses, perception obscuring, blocking mental and intellectual capacity for perception and sense organs, and obstacles, blockage of energy force inherent in the jiva. The main practice of Jainism are vows of austerity, all centering around the ahimsa principle and a voluntary renunciation of activities with the goal of limiting harmful activities. The goal of the vows of austerity is to shed accumulated bad karma through sacrifice and the cessation of acquiring new karma, leading to enlightenment and eventual moksha. In reality, it's not just bad karma, probably accumulating karma at all, but I put in bad anyways. These austerities include not just action, but in speech and thought, purifying not only the body, but the heart, speech, and mind. Although certainly seizing harmful actions is a first step, enlightenment comes from eventually purity of mind. Another important Jain concept is anekantavada, on without, eka one onto side, meaning without one side or many sidedness, a Jain doctrine about metaphysical truths. That is an ancient precursor to my multiple truth hypothesis and related to ahimsa. In future essays, I will return to a deeper analysis of Jain theology, but ahimsa is not only the central doctrine of the Jain religion, but a fundamental concept to understand the origins and destination of the soul and the purpose of creation. And the ahimsa principle is the central tenet from which other tenets derive. All dharmic societies are based on the ahimsa principle, including the foundation of the modern state of India. One of Mahatma Gandhi's main slogans was Ahimsa Paramo Dharma, the Mahabharata, meaning ahimsa is the highest moral virtue. Gandhi's main philosophy of Satyagraha, Satya meaning truth, Graha holding firm to, is based on the 2 principles of truth and ahimsa. Regarding the ahimsa principle, Gandhi referred to ahimsa as the bedrock of Satyagraha, the irreducible minimum to which Satyagraha adheres and is the final measure of its value. Besides as a moral virtue to live by, Gandhi held ahimsa to be a scientific principle to which law and governance of society could be derived. However, many Hindus disagree with Gandhi's position on ahimsa as an absolute value leading to pacifism, but a relative principle where violence is in many cases needed. The main idea is that the totality of violence be reduced for the ahimsa principle to be upheld, as in the Mahabharata and the Battle of Kurukshetra, where Arjuna is advised by Krishna to go to war. Krishna returns to restore Dharma, Bhagavad Gita 4:7, even using violence in order to restore society back to the proper Dharma while minimizing violence in totality. Many interpret the Ramayana in terms of just war theory and the ahimsa principle, where violence is the last resort, but justice must be restored, and vanquishing the wicked ultimately reduces suffering. But even in cases where violence is required to reduce the overall level of violence, the ahimsa principle is always the main guiding principle that dictates action, especially on the battlefield, as using violence even to ultimately reduce violence should be the option of last resort. Although the ahimsa principle derives from dharmic religions, it is applicable to all peoples. Many Western movements are greatly influenced by the ahimsa principle. Utilitarianism has many parallels to the ahimsa principle, but usually formulated in the opposite terminology of maximizing of benefits for the majority as opposed to the minimization of suffering. The non-aggression principle in modern libertarianism also parallels to the ahimsa principle, more related to limited government and personal freedoms, but formulated on the logic of minimization of harm. Dr. Martin Luther King based much of his civil rights activisms on the principle of nonviolence, crediting Gandhi and Dharmic traditions. Dr. Martin Luther King himself made pilgrimage to India in 1959 and credited Gandhi Satyagraha as a large influence. Without directly tracing the origins of Western movements to Vedic origins, they can still be interpreted as applications and derivatives of the Ahimsa principle. The word ahimsa has only entered the Western lexicon to a limited extent, but the concept has become increasingly popular in response to constant war and damage to the environment. Often the biblical traditions put man at the center of creation and tend towards interpretations of a fight of good versus evil that normalize constant struggle and damage to the environment. Vegetarianism is spreading rapidly also spreading in response to constant warfare, group struggles, and awareness of the unnecessary suffering of fellow humans. Many connect increased vegetarianism and universal humanism with dharmic religions, but even seen as independent movements can still be understood as derivatives of the Ahimsa principle. The more the Ahimsa principle spreads, we can hope to decrease suffering and negative aspects of society, and people can openly factor the minimization of harm into governance of society. The Ahimsa principle is not simply a principle that governs action, but our heart, speech, and mind, but is important for internal purification and character refinement. Although many people may not be familiar with the long history and deep theology of Ahimsa, the elimination of unnecessary pain and suffering is obvious as an altruistic and worthy goal. We have a tendency for selfishness to amplify our own suffering and diminish the suffering of others, hence the need for larger principle to understand the role of suffering and the noble goal of reducing suffering. In future essays, I'll return to Dharmic principles, but due to the importance and primacy of Ahimsa, started with Ahimsa. All of our actions, thought, and speech can and should be guided by the Ahimsa principle, gauging whether it is harmful or not. The realm of action is the most important to start, as we can cause extreme harm to ourselves and others through action, but ahimsa should be equally applied to speech, which can also cause great harm to ourselves and others, and eventually applied to thought, purifying the nature of our own minds. The Dharmic traditions not only provide great guidance for the governance of actions in society, but the purification of our own minds and hearts and the possibility of liberation.
Great. That's great. Well, congratulations on getting all those views. That was really good. I'm happy to hear it. So, you got any ideas what you're going to write about next?
I might try to write something related to chess. I was thinking like the Kabbalah and chess, something like on that, just because this one was pretty popular and a lot of people are like, what does this have to do with chess? So, um, you're relatively my Twitter reviews only got tens of views. So over 90% of my views have been on the chess server. So yeah, I'm definitely going to try to write something next on chess. And I'm thinking like on a spiritual interpretation of chess, it may be specific to the history of or the Kabbalistic interpretation of the game of chess.
And you think you'll have that done by next week, or you're not sure?
I'll try to have it done by next week. I'll see how complicated it is, or maybe I'll try to just write a shorter one to get it out by next week because this is the research I've mostly done already. Although once you start and you're like, oh man, did I cover this? Did I cover that? Your research is can be
Yeah,
endless. So I
I
think I
know the
know,
feeling.
but just to pump out an essay. So hopefully I'll be able to pump out an essay for next week.
You can bask in the glow of this one for a couple weeks, I think. You're putting me to shame, I say. Just joking.
Um,
I've been
well,
trying to
yeah,
think about how to go. Sorry, go ahead.
yeah. I mean, it's not a competition, but also like I'll probably get more views on my next essay if I pump it out, because although I'm still getting quite a few views, like it's still even a few hundred a day, it's going down. And so the people looking at my page, that I'll be more likely to get uh reach a larger audience if I could get another essay out quickly. Just like streaming, I noticed having a hard time getting over 10 viewers on my live stream, and just I'm not putting out regular content, and you lose people. So definitely try to put out regular content.
Great. I guess you're not thinking about having Charles on?
He canceled this week, and I was almost ready to just like give up, and because I don't even know if anyone who watches my content is watching that anymore, and it seems to like be going nowhere. It's almost like negative energy, because I don't really care to like his commentary, his like complaint critiques on society. To me, it's just like negative energy. We'll call it a violation of the ahimsa principle. That, I mean, Dharma needs to be restored, but just kind of like his constant, what's wrong with society, and but I think we lost control of the value proposition, and I'm not sure I'll be able to speak about it with him, like, talk about the direction of the show. If I, mention it, he'll probably take it personal, as a personal attack, and respond by attacking me, because it's just pretty common human nature. But he didn't stream this week, and he said he wanted to sue Google, because I feel it, like, okay, like, he's been labeled as a misinformation agent. So it's like, I don't even want to talk with him anymore. He just misinformation. He's been officially labeled. Feel bad, like I'm going to dump him in his time of need. But to some extent, we'll see if next week he wants to talk, and maybe we'll be able to have some sort of like open forum of you know what's going on, why, in what direction to take the show, because like our viewership's down. Almost none of the people that watch my content watch that anymore, and I'm almost embarrassed to just like share the content to promote it. So if that's the case, then we should probably just stop doing it. But if he wants to keep on doing it, I'll probably say yes, or at least see if we could publicly talk it out.
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of really like the big news. The U.S. the abortion, they finally overturned Roe versus Wade, and people knew it was coming. And if we want to interpret why is it such a triggering issue, you could just analyze. So,
Well, you can just summarize it quickly. US is supposed to be land of freedom, and that's like a freedom to choose. That's Isn't that it?
what is the but why is that triggering, in terms of just you to have some sort of analysis and
Because if
understanding that there's
you believe that it's the land of the free, you're expecting freedoms to be respected, and Roe v. Wade is perceived as a step forward in freedom. I mean, that's obvious.
um was that actually what's triggering people, and saying it's triggering on both sides. So that's triggering for people that are upset about the ruling, but saying that's equally triggering for people that are anti-abortion, and but I'm more for kind of like calm analysis, and to examine, to say like, even when I'm picking on you for your like insistence on my independence, and
Have
it's
you
like,
read
well,
Freakonomics? Have you read Freakonomics, the book?
I don't think I read that book. I've heard of it, but
Anyway. Okay, yeah, so it's triggering. I mean, obviously it's triggering for a lot. I mean, it's triggering not just for what I said. It's a very intimate issue, clearly.
It's triggering to examine a viewpoint opposite to yours and just say, well, let's, um, calm down, remove yourself from yourself, and you could examine the opposition point to something, even your own beliefs. Is okay. Well, you're biased. Maybe that's not possible, or there's a limitation to the ability to do it. But certainly to have good programming, and then if you're just trying to promote yourself or your own beliefs, you got to have an audience. So if whatever he's doing is running his, driving away his own audience, then then there's no value proposition. You're repeating yourself or trying to convince people to take your viewpoint, but no one's listening to you.
Fair enough. Fair enough. You want to talk about the debate, or is there anything in particular about your article you wanted to discuss?
No, I guess not. It's pretty straightforward. I'm glad it's getting, like there's a lot more to go in depth on, but so I'll have to do the research on that, and I'll probably put that off a little bit to return more to first chess, and then maybe some form of cognitive science. But it's important. I wanted to get it out there, and I mention on the chess server actually all the time. I talk about the hints of principle in the chat all the time. So I'm glad, and I guess it's not that well known. Like even my mom said she wasn't even sure she ever even heard the word ahimsa. And so I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, my mom's like she never played it. She'd be like a Jeopardy champion. She's got countless general knowledge, and she said she wasn't sure she even heard the word ahimsa. So good to expand in what I put in the essay about the problems facing society, and just the power of the ahimsa principle to examine so like to drive politics from it. And you could look at utilitarianism as a form of that already. And but yes, I'm glad it's
You
well
could say that
received.
politics has been on a one-way street towards pure utilitarianism since Aristotle, because of the whole public-private good divide. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, even Aristotle, I guess, has this concept of maximizing the good. But ahimsa, I mean, almost like a formulation of the golden rule: don't do unto others that which you wouldn't want done unto yourself, as the
a
minimization.
negation principle is not the same as an imperative, though. Like a positive assertion and a negative methodology isn't the same thing.
Well, if you applied it to because utilitarianism focuses on maximizing benefit, it could diminish the value of suffering because suffering could maximum benefit, even like abortion or something like that. I mean, and you could reverse some to some extent the maximization of benefit and the minimization of harm are flip side of the same equation, and you could always convert one from the other. But the fact that in the West that it's generally been focused on the maximization of benefit as opposed to the minimization of harm.
Yep.
Even the libertarianism, okay, like generally I'm a libertarian, um, like abortion or something like that. So I said, well, pro-life kind of sits with it. Like, well, of course I'm pro-life. Like, why would anyone want to abort a fetus like that? Just, but it's more.
Because the life is going to be more suffering than dying quickly, presumably. If you wanted to argue, not that I'm saying I'm taking this position, I'm just saying that it's an arbitrary.
Well, so if you want to examine it from the viewpoint of the ahimsa principle, so if you just want to be like, well, my body, my choice, that the ahimsa principle is irrelevant. It's my body, my choice, and whether it's in accordance or violation of the ahimsa principle makes no difference. So from like the constitutional level,
Yeah, there's
You don't.
tons of arguments for it. I just mentioned the free one before. I'm just saying I do think it's pretty easy to make an ahimsa argument.
Well,
That's
ahimsa.
why, like,
Wait, so
ahimsa
if you
has
have
to be
to,
intention. It can't just be action facing, otherwise it's not really doesn't really make sense.
well, if you're gonna say, abortion is legal because it's a woman's right to choose, and she doesn't need to justify her action, versus you saying that, like, no, a woman doesn't have the right to choose. It has to be a minimization of the ahimsa principle, and she can only have an abortion if it minimizes the ahimsa principle.
I didn't say that.
Well, I'm just talking about methods to analyze the issue. So you could try to make the broader argument of pro-choice that it has nothing to do with the ahimsa principle, that even if it is in violation of the ahimsa principle, it's a woman's right to choose. You could phrase that in terms of the ahimsa principle, that causing harm by taking away a woman's right to choose, that in theory, maybe many abortions don't minimize harm, and it causes more harm to abort the fetus than whatever harm would be to the woman. But to take rights away from people, to have some sort of central authority that exerts power over people, increases harm and violates the ahimsa principle. So as a libertarian, the non-aggression principle, that's generally how I'd look at it, to say, well, yeah, I mean, I kind of have pro-life leanings. I don't like the idea of abortion, but at the same time, I don't want to strengthen the power of the government to take rights away, to enforce it on people. So even so that's the in libertarianism referred to as the non-aggression principle, specifically in relation to the government uh, exerting power over the people. And so it doesn't use the terminology ahimsa, the non-aggression principle, but from a libertarian perspective, to say, even though generally I think abortion is wrong and would advise against it, um, I think it's more dangerous to give the power to the government to enforce my morals, or even any morals, on people. And so you could call that an ahimsic calculation.
It just makes God out to be a some kind of an absentee landlord. Don't do this thing. But after that, it's just, all bets are off.
Well, no, because that you're talking about man and law. So if you're talking like from, like that mentioned, the Jainism, it would say that ahimsa is related to karma, because, and it's, like a dualistic aspect, because when you violate the ahimsa principle, the karma is stored and comes back to you. It's like causes a damage to the soul, and it's attached to the soul. So that if someone, let's say in theory, a woman has an abortion, God forbid, and medically, physically, there's no imprint, that it didn't cause any physical imprint on the woman. It happened. It was clean. It was done. Um, it's finished. So if there's an imprint of, they say, no, that was a violation of the ahimsa principle. There's a life that would have came to being, but there's no recording in the material world of that occurrence. And so legally, like, well, she had the right to do it. She did it. It's done. So if it was a violation of the ahimsa principle, that's a spiritual factor that weighs in on the soul. And that in return will likely have effects in the material world, but it's mediated through non-physical effects. So I mean, that's why ahimsa is related to karma, and it's a spiritual principle. So there's a question of, in Judaism, call it like din in the law. Okay, you did the crime, but there's no legal punishment. You're not going to be punished by the hands of the court of man. But say the court of God still is true, and if there's negative karma attached to it, that works scientifically, and that's what how the ahimsa principle is central to dharmic religions. It's definitional in dharma that harm, bad karma attaches to your soul and will have effects in the future, even if there was no material consequence at the time. That's why I put
Yep.
like to people that if a tree falls in the forest and no one hears it, to well, if so, if there's a murder and there's no witnesses and no evidence. So I said, well, if a tree fell in the forest, did it make any sound? If a woman had an abortion and there's no penalty and there's no physical remnants of the occurrence, did it have a moral imprint? Did it make a sound? And I said, well, of course it made a sound
One
because
of the oldest questions out there.
because karma is factual, and that's why I argue with T jump. Karma has to be mediated by non-physical mechanisms.
He's just going to say quantum fields.
The quantum fields are physical mechanisms. So I say that if you want to claim that karma could be mediated by quantum fields,
I don't want to do that. I was just playing devil's advocate for his position, and I was wondering what you thought about it. And now
that wasn't his position. His position that karma is not true, and like Ben Watkins, that the universe is indifferent to our suffering, and so, if that perspective, if a tree falls in the forest and no one sees it, it doesn't make a sound. If a person kills someone and there's no witnesses and no evidence, they get away with it. And that was how T Jump directly argued. He's like, "What are you talking about? There's tons of people that do horrible things and get away with it and have a wonderful life."
Right. The if God real, why bad thing happen? My argument against that is that free will is the freedom to do what would be perceived as evil by people, but God is beyond a duality like good and evil.
Well, when we talk about this debate, but you're saying that there's a factual phenomenon of karma. So T Jump is saying their karma is false. There is no
He's saying
factual.
quantum fields. And then if I say, does that include he
Mention
was
anything about
arguing in
quantum
favor
field.
of causality. I can just say karma is causality. He accepts karma if he accepts causality.
Yeah, maybe you're just playing the dumb word game. You're saying that's not what it means by. They're saying they're saying no, he rejected karma, and if you want to say karma means physical action reaction, and therefore he does believe in it, you're just playing unnecessary
He
word
rejected that actions have consequences.
In terms of good and bad and morality.
He rejected basically that actions have consequences in a moral sense, yes. He did not reject the principle of causality, which is what I would describe karma to be. But I guess you're right that karma is understood differently.
Karma is generally referring to, you have a generalized form of karma that includes material laws, but karma is generally referring to moral laws.
Karma is cause and effect.
Yeah, that's the relationship to the ahimsa principle, that you acquire bad karma by violating the ahimsa principle.
Bad karma is like a personal karma, not a general principle of cause and effect. So
yeah, so is it that's so T Jump, you say the ahimsa principle might be a nice precept, but it's not factored into the universe. You don't acquire bad karma by hurting people.
there you go. So maybe he'd agree with the principle of causality, but disagree that hurting people leads to you having that sort of a bad consequence for you in some sense.
I don't want to make it too complicated for you, because this is where you get in this loop and saying, but karma is mind dependent. Good and bad is mind dependent. Individual minds determine whether actions are good and bad, but there's no factual reality of karma. It's mind dependent. So if you have a view of there being like a global mind or karma being mind mediated, but from T Jump's view, mind arises from the brain, and concepts like good and bad and karma are the product of the brain. And me and you could think about it and agree on the concept, but it's just a product of our minds and doesn't have any factual reality in the material realm. And you have the laws of man for how we deal with actions, but this was if there's no evidence and there's no witnesses, is there an imprint? And so religiously, you're saying that there's no karma is not mediated. I mean, it would be complicated because what do you mean by mind? But karma is mediated by the laws of science. It's not an independent product of individual minds. And that was my general argument against atheism is that you need dualism. You don't necessarily need theism, but you need dualism for karma. And so T Jump was fine. He's like, well, we don't need karma. Karma's false. Karma, is a hindrance to the advancement of man because it's a false idea.
What'd you think of the philosophy, the theist guy?
Yeah, it was poorly framed, and that's why I would have focused on dualism because, like,
I think we should focus on the actual. I mean, I thought it was I was pretty impressed. I'll be honest. To take that position to defend it is, yeah. I don't
well, I
know.
would defend it. I think I might have even performed better than them, but just
It's easy to say that from the bleachers.
well, I mean, they asked me, but yeah, I mean, I mean,
I mean, the actual argument like that he made, he was basically saying that God is a mind necessary for categories. I guess I was wondering if you thought that that was a good summary of that line of thinking.
no, I mean, it was poor definition, and it's saying that
What?
really you need to. It means that chart I made about dualism and deism, where if you're saying that there's a non-material realm where these things are mediated from or controlled from, and the deity is part of that realm. So what do they mean by deism? Theism um, wasn't clearly defined, and to me, I think you need dualism to define theism, where first you need to establish that there's a separate realm where that is not that is
That doesn't even solve it, I don't think, because if the separate realm is conceptual, that doesn't get you to theism.
it's not conceptual. It's just saying that as if you want to conceptualize, but saying that that there's a separate non-material realm, and the deity exists or rules from the non-material realm.
And that's theism.
Well, so you could conceivably be a materialist theist, where you're saying that there's only a material realm and the deity exists in the material realm and has controlling power over the material realm. Um, but I don't think so. I think almost all theists are dualists.
Um, well, that's saying
It's,
if you're a non-dualist, then you're not a theist, which seems absurd.
I would argue that yeah, you have to be a dualist. Theists are by definition dualist, but that's why I thought it was a poor framing of the debate.
So you're saying
And
Shankaracharya wasn't a theist? What the hell was he then?
um, We could argue if he was a Mayavadi, that's saying he wasn't a theist. He was a Mayavadi that thought the only thing that existed was the material realm. And that's why it would be pejoratively referred to as a Mayavadi, where he was trapped in Maya, trapped in the illusion. Um, or you could argue that Shankaracharya was, in essence, still a dualist
Um,
in the terminology,
you
like
could argue that dualism grounds intelligibility in natural language. I don't think you can get past that, though.
yeah, I mean, you're going to have the same problem we always have is that you're too much advancing your own worldview than to just meta analyze the possibilities.
I'm trying to understand what you're saying. You're saying we need dualism
Well, I'm explaining why you can't understand what
for
I'm saying
theism.
because it contradicts your own system, and therefore you hit a mental block on understanding what I'm saying because it can't get past the contradiction to your own beliefs. You'd be like Charles Moskowitz, or you take it as an attack on you because I'm saying something that probably contradicts your beliefs.
I just wanted to know how you account for people like Shankaracharya if you need dualism for theism. Because to
Well,
me,
I
dualism
mean,
is
there's schools of
materialism
thought in
is dualistic.
Shankaracharya what he meant by what he's saying. So you either say that he wasn't a deist, or you could say that he was a dualist. He was a deist and a dualist. Well, you have to interpret his thought, and I'm not enough an expert, but I know there's schools of interpretation of him. And one is that he was just simply a Mayavadi, and he was incorrect. Um, and there's other
Uh,
schools that
Incorrect how exactly? I mean, that's presuming your own conclusion pretty
I'm not making
much.
my conclusion. I'm saying from a school of thought. So there's the schools of thought within Hinduism that Shankaracharya was incorrect, and he was incorrect about his. Um, I'm not sure if you call him Advaita, if non-dualism, or how to actually classify it. I have to do the research to turn to put
It
the
may not
terminology
translate. We should
correct
probably go
correctly.
with the assumption that it doesn't really translate, but it is unclear to me that there is even a context for non-dualism outside of theism. That's why I was sort of confused as to what you meant there.
What I'm saying is a Mayavadi mean a non-dualist, or can you be a dualist Mayavadi? So I mean,
To
generally,
me, yeah, you'd be a dualist Mayavadi if you were doing idolatry, not worshiping the actual God, which pretty much nobody does because it's the impersonal God.
yeah. I mean, so I mean, generally, like the Mayavadi, Maya refers to the material realm that we exist in of materialism. So I mean, there's different ways of understanding it, and if you get a like a canonization of Hinduism in the schools
Do you
to
really think you can beat Advait on a basis of a logical contradiction?
well, no, I'm saying there's schools of thought. So I'm saying like there's in saying that there's schools in contradiction to each other. So like no, I don't think like
No, they all accept the ahimsa principle. I can't see any of them denying Ayurveda. That's already a huge metaphysical inheritance.
well, I mean that's Hinduism, so, but I'm saying that they're general accepted, well documented principles of general Hinduism, but there's still uh, dualist and non-dualistic schools within Hinduism
Mhm.
that critique each other, and so there's multiple truth
They
hypothesis
wouldn't say, wrong.
that
They
I
would say
happen to
not
be
living up to this standard to a high enough level or whatever.
I happen to be a dualist, but saying that I'm
Being
not.
wrong is always qualified. It's like you've made a mistake in domain X, not just you've been disproven, unreserved disapproval. Or disproof. That's not really a thing.
I mean, generally, so there's uncertainty, and
There's not really that much uncertainty because you would qualify the domain that you were debating in.
Well, I think because
Shankaracharya
there's
did.
enough uncertainty that major schools exist on both sides of the issue.
Nobody disagrees on ahimsa.
Yes, there's not uncertainty within dharmic religions on ahimsa. There's uncertainty on dualism versus non-dualism. So therefore, there's major dualistic schools and major non-dualistic schools.
And you seem to want to reduce non-dualism to Mayavadiism?
No, I'm saying that's just the dualistic school critique of the non-dualist. I mean, you mentioned Shankaracharya and saying if Shankaracharya is a non-dualist, then it's just saying the critiques that the dualists give to Shankaracharya. Like ISKCON and Prabhupada refers to him as a Mayavadi.
Strange.
Which is
Rick says the way past that mental block is to mutually agree on a foundation and stick to it. That's not our strength. Our strength is that we're sort of have different perspectives, but a very, I don't want to say similar work ethic, but mutual respect. So I think in most cases, yeah, you got to stick to, there's the containment of uncertainty. There's the range over which you're actually making an assertion here. So that's the most clear thing. That's important to get clear right off the bat. That's not the level that we're talking about, but I would agree that in most cases, like Doovid and I don't interact that way, but most cases, it is a situation of having to explain something to someone. Can't really interact with an idea when it's incomprehensible. So this is where the foundation comes in and so on and so forth. And that's where it becomes sticky because feeling like something makes sense, even being able to use methodologies in a particular subject, that doesn't mean you can then turn around and explain the methodology itself. That's certainly not a necessary condition to utilize tech. So then it becomes a question of justifying the mutually agreed upon foundation. And that becomes a question of, well, how much can you actually use these concepts in language? How much can you articulate how you learn? That's not something anyone really has necessarily any reason to know how to express. Anyway, go ahead.
You have schools of thought when there's a reasonable uncertainty, like abortion, where there's a reasonably almost even split where there's uncertainty enough to create a school of thought on both sides and to be a societal divide. And so there's reasonable uncertainty. So even if you're in one school of thought, you're pro-choice or pro-life, you might attack the other side. But you're saying from an objective, right? Objective may not the right word, but from some level, there's reasonable uncertainty, and therefore there's schools of thought. Just like in theology, where there's reasonable uncertainty on many issues, therefore you have schools of thought that divide the population and divide the sages, and you're going to find sages on opposite sides of these issues. Even in science, like the Copenhagen School, or you have uncertainty onto the true explanation or understanding of the phenomenon. And due to that uncertainty, you have schools of thought that develop around different explanations. If that's dualism versus monism or uh, materialism, atheism, that these are classical issues that have perplexed humans for as long as recorded history, and therefore there's schools of thought that you constantly find the sages of each generation on the opposite sides of. And so if you're promoting your school of thought, you might attack the other school. You might use sophistry or hyperbole, but so from the philosophically more objective standards, you recognize there's a lot of uncertainty on these issues, and that's why these schools of thought persist, to this day. That you might be vehemently pro-life, but you say there's enough uncertainty that it explains why there's different schools of thought. You're just gonna be like, "Oh, I'm right and everyone else is wrong." You say like, "No, there's sufficient uncertainty to warrant schools of thought dividing humanity."
Do you want to go on to the debate with atheism and theism?
Yeah, so I was just making my preliminary points where, to me, it's the poor way to frame the debate that I would have atheism versus even atheism versus theism. If you're talking about science, so there's two levels. There's a level of dualism and then to theism. And it's like technically you could be an atheist dualist, although the vast majority of atheists are materialists. And technically, it's possible you could be a materialist theist. But if I would have framed it that science is framed in a dualistic understanding, and then the question of the deity um, isn't necessary. That, I mean, you could talk about the deity, but it's more important for the framing of science, dualism than theism. So within that, that if science is a self-contained set of rules where the system that contains science is capable of describing itself versus the dualistic aspect, it was saying that science explains material laws, but the system of the material laws can't contain its own explanation, and the explanation for those laws exist in a separate non-material realm. And so if you're the debate on which better explains science, that's how I would argue that you need a system that includes more than just the material realm to derive the rules that control the material realm. And so if you're a materialist, then you're stuck with how can the system contain the rules that control the system, and even the question of
Are you
higher order.
reasoning, just real quick, are you basing this off of a Godelian truth model, or are you coming at this through a coherence language approach?
I'm generally phrasing in the classical.
You're saying science can't ground itself, as in nothing can, or what are, sorry, I just want to make sure I'm taking your meaning correctly.
This is the classical Western canon from like the Greeks till the modern era, that to some extent it's passing the buck, but just saying the material realm can't contain within it, the system itself can't contain the rule. I mean, I guess if I phrase it in terms of like a mathematical logic, but saying science is a materialistic thing. The rules of science are unique to explanations of material phenomenon, the scientific method, but it is grounded in a philosophy, and that philosophy intrinsically has to assume or you purport as an axiom that there's another realm where these rules exist. So, in the scientific process of discovering truths, but where these truths exist in this in a non-material realm, which I keep on referring to dualism. I'll call the spiritual realm, or you'll call theism the realm of God. And that's why the framework of science works better in a theistic, dualistic concept, because the system can't contain within itself the very rules that describe it. You need an alternative framework to have the rules or the governing principles, even higher order rules in general. So I mean that's would be generally my view or interpretation of the classical view. So there's many aspects of what they debated, and the question of how much science or the rules could describe of the observed phenomenon. But just so he was quoting Kant, the one person, and I have here my Kant, the philosophy of Kant, or reread my Kant, and I mentioned Kant in the previous essay on critical theory because the Frankfurt School critical theory is based on Kant and Hegel and critique. Kant wrote those Critique of Pure Reason, Critique and Critique, and the notion of criticism in terms of the Kantian sense from the ancient Greek sense. Uh, but that was the classical Greek understanding of dualism, that these forces that control the material realm are independent of the material realm. And if you want to call those scientific laws, that the mediating factors that control the material realm can't be self contained in the material realm. They have to derive from someplace else.
So it's a coherence condition. You're saying it's basically an incoherent to have only one thing.
Well, they focus on God. So the logic of putting that to God is an extra step. So that's why I said, like, I would have focused more on dualism and say that, okay, the higher order rules of science are mediated from the spiritual realm, the non material realm. And then the question of the deity or God is a separate question, because you don't need, you could be a dualist without a deity. So so how they framed it, so that's why I thought the framing was kind of weak in that sense, that that the deity, that you establish that the deity is outside of the laws of the material, and then to make a separate step that science necessitates to being mediated from a non-material, a separate realm, uh, and then the extra step of there being a deity that's the force that mediates these laws.
There you go.
So that's why I thought was weak, and I guess conceptually it's very difficult for people who mention non-material realm and deity, and they put it all together into one, and that's why I thought it was kind of weakly framed from the theist aspect, because you're just like, well, God, but they didn't really define God, and they didn't really define, like, what does it mean? Is there a spiritual realm where these things mediated from? So it just like T jump, it's just like, oh, magic man, like science can't explain, so therefore
I know.
magic
How
man.
many times is he going to say Sky Daddy?
Well,
Like
because
I'm
that's
just waiting for the day where someone makes a compilation video where it's just him being like, Sky Daddy, Sky Daddy, Sky Daddy. Like,
yeah, so
seriously,
that's why I spoke
become
of
a
T jump.
theist.
He didn't say that because I focused on the spiritual realm. Because you're saying you don't need a sky daddy, you focus on like Plato and the forms, and just say that there these uh, higher order rules are mediated from a non-material realm. And obviously you have the interaction problem and there's difficulties, but the ontology that the one guy focuses on, like by Kant and his ontology, um, it seemed he could have made it simpler. You're just saying, what is the origin of higher order rules? How is it possible for the material realm to create, or I mean, create might be the wrong word, or to, even for there to exist? What how is it possible that the rules that govern uh, the system can exist from within the same system? or derived from the system. And so JF is like, well, I don't
The
know how they
system,
derive, just
the
the
system we're
law.
calling matter is a subset of the rule, is how.
Well, I mean, if you're giving your own view, but I'm saying from the atheistic view or the materialistic view, what is the origin of the concept of higher order rules? Why should there be higher order
There you go.
rules that govern the material realm? And then if there are higher order rules that are consistent throughout the material realm, what force? How could there be a force that derives from itself that mediates the whole material realm to have these rules be consistent?
Sure.
And why should one cell operate according to the same rules of another cell?
Consciousness.
Well, you're giving an answer, but it's saying
But
from your specific, but you're saying there's a non-material mediating force. So you might give that a name of consciousness by saying from the pure epistemology, what we're saying is that there has to be a mediating force that is mediating from outside of the material realm. And like you want to call that consciousness, they want to call it God.
no, I'm saying either you can say materialism is so vague as to be meaningless, or you can say, yeah, it's incoherent and you need God to ground materialism.
Well, it's like, I mean, it's a question of the Platonic forms, and saying, well, mathematics and laws are, kind of like the modern Platonic forms.
Math has become modern Platonism. Yeah, I would agree on that. And I think I've even said pretty much exact same thing as that. Glad you agree with me. So you don't think, I thought, okay, I've never seen this guy's content before. The theist guy who made the perspective philosophy. Excuse me if I got that wrong. I respect the argument tremendously because it's saying you need a mind. Is that actually God, though? That's when I was sort of, okay. Doooovid walked off there, so I'm not sure how to take that. But I don't understand what you're saying, moral outrage prophet, either. Okay, there you go. He's back. So
Was you made notes or something?
I made a bunch of notes.
Can share?
I had no real commentary on the theists other than the art. Well, I really respect the fact that he went to bat for 300 years of that, and I'll never, not respect people for taking positions that are hard to defend on principle. And
Before you go to your notes, let me just repeat this
yeah,
one more
sure.
time to clarify, because I'll put in terms like karma, the implication that there's a spiritual realm that mediates and has causal effect in the material realm and referred to as karma. Then the deity is a separate issue of you're saying you could have karma without a deity. So, and then just the question of the uncreated world. Well, who created the world? I don't know. Who created karma? I don't know. So there's well, karma had to be created. There has to be a deity, or karma itself has to be mediated, and it's mediated by the deity. So if you want to put like mind, that there has to be mind that mediates, and the mind has to be separate from the material realm, and then to make a separate step to the deity. So that's even within Hinduism, there's criticized schools of thought that think that there's no deity and only karma. And that could be even like Shankaracharya, that would say karma is factual, but the deity is not. And I don't know if that, I mean, there's schools to, say, what did Shankaracharya actually say? But if, Shankaracharya said that there's an unmediated karma, that the material realm is mediated by uh, a non material force of karma, but the force of karma is not mediated by a third force or another higher force being the deity. And so I'm not sure if the theist had conceptualized properly this framing, and I think it makes it complicated because if you're switching around, well, is God karma? What's the difference between God and karma? And are you saying that the definition of God is karma? And so it becomes complicated. It's like, no, God is not karma. Karma is a non-material force, but it's not God.
Well, that would be like saying, is God equal to Dharma? It's sort of a category error.
Yeah, so I think that was problematic on the theist end of not clarifying that. Um, T Jump and JF were better rhetoricians, better debaters. But I was actually reasonably impressed with both the theist. I know you had your biological tree of life thing that you DM'd me about a few times, and we haven't talked about, or if you have notes or want to do a full review of the debate.
I just wanted to go over the ideas that I found interesting. I didn't flow it or anything. But would be hard to flow that. But basically, I thought the theist position reduced to God grounds intelligibility because it's a cosmic mind that is responsible for making categories. And you're saying that's shit, basically. Not to like paraphrase you too much, but you didn't find that compelling. Because it's basically, I'm looking at my notes.
I found it compelling, but it wasn't for theism. Like really, what they were arguing for was dualism.
Okay, whether the target was a hit would require us to define God. I don't want to do that. I just want to look at the argument on its merits.
And were they really arguing for God, or were they arguing for a mediating, controlling, non-material factor that I say is dualism? And so
they're saying that
take
this
this step.
mediating, controlling category maker is the justification for why God is a necessary being.
Yeah, and saying that's really like a category mistake that they themselves made, because really what they were arguing for was dualism, and then on top of that, if they wanted to argue for a God, they would have to make a separate argument because the majority of their arguments weren't actually for a deity; it was for uh, dualism, and so it was just the whole debate was kind of a category mistake, and I think it was unnecessarily probably confusing and probably maybe they lost the debate, and if they had clarified that a little bit better and just what does God mean, and their logical arguments aren't really for God, their logical arguments are for a non-material mediating force.
A non-material mediating force, aka an ordering principle.
Dualism.
So, okay.
I'm calling it dualism, and it's hard to come up with the terminology, but saying the material
Absolutely.
realm has to be mediated by a separate realm, usually referred to as the spiritual realm, which is the term dualism, and there could be multiple realms. So whatever term that they were talking about, but saying the material realm necessitates something that mediates it and has a control factor, and that doesn't have to be God or theism. And so their arguments were generic for dualism, or they have to separate. Are you arguing for God and a deity, or are you just arguing for a non-material realm that has some sort exerts control over the material realm? And so I thought that was the confusing factor. Even
Or are
now,
you arguing for teachings that are of divine origin to justify access to fundamental precepts about causality?
wait, you say that causality can't exist as a phenomenon without dualism, that causality necessitates.
Absolutely. And I would agree with you that it necessitates more than dualism.
Well, so that's where they had to more clearly define, because they would just say, that's why like the sky daddy, like anytime that you can't explain something perfectly with the material realm, it's like, oh, the sky daddy. And so that's why they fell into that trap of these repetitive arguments where just like, oh, science can't explain this, therefore God. And it's like, well, no, that's not really a strong argument. You're saying science can't explain this because you need a non-material mediating factor, and that non-material mediating factor is not God, just like karma is not God. And so to come on to what do you mean by theism and what do you mean by God? And so just by demonstrating that, so their whole argument was largely a category area. That's why they kept on repeating like the sky daddy and this like, oh, every single time that science can't perfectly explain something, you think that's some kind of proof for God. And so they didn't make like a consistent, coherent argument of some sort of functioning dualistic system.
Well, yeah, that would
And
be
it's probably,
very difficult, wouldn't it? Because they'd have to ground things in something that wasn't theology. I don't
well, they
want to
probably
set
hadn't
a
studied
precedent, but
classical
they're not going to be
theology.
the ones to do it.
They probably haven't read enough classical theology, or you maybe prayed or whatever to have a consistent dualistic approach. So they might not even in their own
JF would
conceptualization.
probably say that he's knows math and therefore he has Platonic, quote, what amounts to dualism under his belt through math. Who
Listen, they
can't, like,
haven't studied the
anybody who
Greeks.
knows math might be apt to take such a position when they realize certain things.
Yeah, maybe they hadn't studied the Greeks, and therefore they weren't able to frame their arguments properly, and they're switching around their arguments, and as where T Jump and JF were relatively consistent, and so that's why I'm harping on this, saying that the importance of establishing dualism for a theistic point of view, and then to say that the spiritual realm is not God, it's not the deity. You need a spiritual realm, and the spiritual realm mediates the material realm, but the spiritual realm itself is not God. And maybe they themselves don't have it conceptualized like that, so they just have one generic everything non-material is God. Even like that's where you have these deep theological questions like, well, I have a soul, my soul is non-material, uh but is it God? Is my soul God, or is my soul spiritual but is not God? God is something different. And so that's, you have delineations, you have spiritual systems that try to explain this, and that's why you need the concept of realms. And so say, what is the deity? And so their definitions were relatively unclear, and even if they pulled out, saying that they're talking pure philosophy and metaphysics, they're not talking about Christianity, they're just talking about a framework for understanding science, and even to establish science is the laws of the material realm. However, the laws of the material realm don't exist in the material realm. And then, so focusing on God confuses it.
Sure. But the conversations we're able to have are in natural language, which is what people are habituated to, and that's just their own personal karma as debaters. But it's good sign to me if a debate is inspiring uh this much of a description, dissection, critique, however you want to put it. So we've got, yeah, where is I? Let's see. Dang, I've lost my, got so many pages of here we go. God grounds intelligibility by making categories. Um, so in this case, the mind would be not any type of subjectivity. mind would be more akin to an ordering principle. What I think Doovid is alluding to when he says dualism, like, I don't know that I would put it that way. If I was going to try to restate it to see if I'd understood, is basically like,
You just add in whether you say dualism, you're implying that there's two realms, but saying a non-material ordering principle. The origins of this or ordering principle is not material. So if you're thinking about it, when you say that, could you say it's a non-material ordering principle?
well, there's a question: is are the ordering principles of matter? Of matter? Do the causal principles of matter derive from matter? And that appears to be incoherent.
Yes, that's what I'm saying. What you say
But
that
I don't actually think
if you're
it's
looking for the
incoherent
word,
just
you're saying the
necessarily.
ordering principle has to be non-material, or that, and then you just establish everything. The ordering, the higher order rules, the ordering principles can't be part of the system that they describe. They have to originate from a
Unless
separate.
someone can make it coherent for an ordering principle to be material. Someone would. I'm not saying that that's impossible, but the burden is on the claimant if someone wants to make that claim. That's why I was going for so long on the notion that materialism is a metaphysical claim, because it is.
Yeah, they should have focused the debate on that and saying
But I
that,
actually think
does
they
it
went.
make
They
more
did a
sense
good
that the
deal going in
ordering
that
principle
direction.
derives from the material, or that the ordering principle derives, that I'm calling dualism, because that's how it was classically framed in the Western canon, that the ordering principle derives from a non-material realm, and that's why theism better frames science, because theism has the framework that the ordering principle that orders the material realm is not part of the material realm. And so if you're an atheist, and then you're going to be forced to say that the ordering principle of the material realm is itself part of the material realm. So that
Yeah.
maybe they did try to clearly say that, but I
I
felt
don't
that,
think they said that at all, Doovid. I just think that it's not bad that they didn't, because that debate can happen sometime in the future. I mean, Ayurveda says we should make changes slowly. So I think this debate is it's a departure in a great direction, and hopefully there'll be more debates up to that level and even possibly more in the future. But I think people do need to get used to these types of exchanges. I don't want to say what amount to atheists on both sides, but what amount to, more balanced in terms of, like, what are we even saying here? Getting past just pure rhetoric, I guess. Just to come to some questions in the chat. Okay, causality is the notion of an ordering principle of, think of dominoes. But no, dominoes without dominoes. That's causality. Determinism is, I can know exactly what's going to happen. If I know enough about a system at a certain time, I can know exactly what's going to happen in the future. That's not possible for several reasons. One, got a little something called the uncertainty principle, which means there's an uncertainty associated with a very small delta x, etc., any type of canonically conjugate observable. What does that mean? Well, guess what? If you're super specific on one observable, aka your interval of uncertainty is very small, aka you have a small window through which the electron goes through, that means you have a large uncertainty associated with momentum, because position and momentum are canonically conjugate observables. That's the law of physics. That law is basically saying, is the big FU to determinism. It's saying, no, there's a limit on determinism. What's the limit on determinism? It's something called the Heisenberg constant, I think. So that's determinism and causality. And then we had another thing in here that was even different from that. And now I don't remember what it was. But yeah. And Doovid's walked off. I guess he's bored of my same explanation of uncertainty for the millionth time. Sorry, I just wanted to make sure that people were following. If you guys can't accept that that means that it's non-deterministic, I don't know what to tell you, because determinism would be, I have a gun with an electron and I know exactly where it's going to go. The presence of that slit makes it impossible to know that in advance of observation. The only thing we can know is if we do enough observations, we can get what's called a distribution, a probabilistic distribution. And that's saying, well, it's not a complete crapshoot of where it's going to go. It's based on our previous experience, going to fall within this distribution, aka an uncertainty interval, aka non-determinism. So if I were you, if you're having trouble with this, think of probability as the opposite of determinism in some sense. If something isn't a superposition, that means it's not determined. Determined is the narrowing of that superposition into one component of the whole thing. Yeah, so anyway, that was all I wanted to say on that. Plus, I've got something on the screen right now that shows you that your intuition's not completely wrong. I get what the issue is. They're co-arising, okay? Dependent arising. Look it up. Delocalization and localization are dependently arising things. It's the same. If you're really completely screwed, just think of it in terms of a single proton. The position of the proton's not defined inside of its circle because it's only defined inside of a single circle or radius or whatever. It's defined inside a single, quote, phase space, aka visualize it like a sphere. Within that sphere of probability, we know it's a 100% chance of observability. In advance of observation, we don't know where the position is. It's not defined in advance of observation. Observation localizes it. That's the whole thing that this is whole, why we got John Williams with the twisty eyes in the chat right now. So take it slow. Understand that these things that appear to be contradictory at the start aren't. They're just telling you different sides of the same thing. And ultimately, the answer to a question, those are also dependently arising things if you know how to read them properly. All right, so let me see. I've got a list of fallacies that I won't go over right now. So I just think the atheists are basically painting themselves into an increasingly absurd corner because they're saying you don't need God to ground intelligibility. But there's no answer for abiogenesis, for consciousness. And I mean, I don't think there's any kind of like consensus on a coherent moral whatever framework. So what are they even kind of saying? Like, you don't need any of that stuff because of fallibilism? It kind of seems odd to take that position because if I was going to argue from the atheist quote unquote position, I'd be saying uh, you don't need theism to ground consciousness, and you can get everything from consciousness. So you don't need theism if you have a sufficiently good consciousness theory. I'm not saying I agree with that. I'm just saying, wouldn't that be the argument to make if you were actually going to be able to defend that position? So yeah, if you just want to eat, I can just keep reading through my notes here. I thought it was really weird that TGM's always appealing to the numbers, like the proportions of people that believe stuff. Look at history. I mean, most of the time, what was popular was subject to certainly
Experts.
reprisal at the very
He doesn't
least.
appeal to he appeals to the number of experts.
Part of appealing to experts is knowing when it's appropriate to do that.
As he made the point that he's appealing to consensus of expert, not consensus of humanity. Just you should be precise in your language.
And that's the thing, John. Everything is not normally distributed because things are subject to entanglement. So systems, depending on how many observations they're subject to, the degree to which they're entangled in advance of measurement, because what's happening is it's entangled. Measurement breaks the symmetry of the entanglement slightly, but it goes back right back to an entangled state. There's no such thing as a non-entangled state. The limit of entanglement would be like a point. That's why I keep saying like it's not a thing. And that's why we can keep observing things like electrons consistently as things because they're limit points of what is actually the thing. Do you have like a short way of saying and maybe a quick justification? Because you always sort of say that you can talk about the philosophy of science, but you can't talk about the science of philosophy. How do you say why that is exactly?
Well, because dualism.
Okay,
Because
so you're saying that it follows from dualism, basically.
yeah, because science is exclusive to material laws, material rules, as opposed to philosophy, which applies to material and non-material things. So the where science fits in necessitates philosophy, because the set of the material and non-material realm is bigger than just the set of the material realm. And there's no descriptive power that science can have over the non-material realm except by eliminating it. And so, like the question, even when I agree with T Jump, of in terms of explanatory power, just like a question of joint attention. So if you're saying from a dualistic perspective, ideas are not a product of the brain. Ideas exist in a separate realm. So from the materialistic perspective, ideas are the product of unique brains, and the product of my brain may or may not be the same of the product as your brain. And there's just communication that has limited accuracy that allows us to have a conversation. From the dualistic perspective, the ideas that we're talking about are not a product of our own minds, they're a product of a separate realm. And therefore, when me and you talk about a concept, we're actually talking about the same concept because we're grasping at the same object of the non-material realm. So just in terms of that, like explanatory power of materialism versus dualism, in simple thing like communication. So science is exclusive to the rules of the material realm. And if ideas are the product of the material realm, I mean, it's the same basic argument that put in mathematical terms, that you can't have a product of the system to explain the system.
Well, what's that based on?
Higher order rules. If there's something, a higher order rule could be descriptive of a system because it's not part of the
I think the
system.
issue is that the data for generating those higher order rules is of matter. And therefore, the argument would be like, well, if the data are matter, then the superposition of the data is also material.
Well, that's the claim that they're going to make, but they still have to come up with some sort of method of how a system could generate its own governing principles.
We're not talking about it generating its own principles. We're talking about the principles being coherent within the system that generated them.
Well, that's
Well,
what I'm saying. That
I don't know
there's
if you'd
no
make that
there's
distinction.
no science of philosophy. There's a philosophy of science. There's no science of philosophy.
I definitely didn't. I didn't understand your reasoning whatsoever. You're saying it's because of dualism. Because
Well,
I'm
on a
sorry.
pure
Like I'm so
logic claim,
confused.
you could make it. So I mean, why I say that, I'm referring to dualism again, but without coming on to dualism, you could just talk about systems and governing rules of systems. That science cannot generate its own rules that govern itself. So philosophy is
Science
the
can't generate its own rules that govern itself. Hey, Bubblegum, I saw that you put in the comments that I don't like you. I do like you. I just thought you could have done better in that debate, and I didn't want you to think that I was taking it easy on you just because you had a position that you thought I was more sympathetic with. Like, I'm not that shallow.
If you want to put it in terms of the mind independent, science is theoretically mind independent, as where philosophy is mind dependent.
Well, yeah, you can say science, modern science is intentionally mind independent because it excludes consciousness.
Yeah, it's a material science in order to be, because it was in the school of dualism, science was created to be an understanding of the material realm. And so it was created to be mind independent because mind is not part of the material realm. Mind is part of a separate realm. That's why, that's why dualism, that's why I keep on going back to dualism and the dualistic foundations of modern science. But for in terms of the debate yesterday, without the foundations, you just say science is mind independent, so philosophy is mind dependent. So philosophy, which is mind independent, cannot generate something that's mind dependent.
I thought you
And
said
then
philosophy was mind dependent.
if you have a materialistic understanding of the brain producing mind, then there is no objective mind.
The
So the
brain producing
concepts that you
mind,
create
there's
in
no
your
objective
brain,
mind, okay, because it's brain emergent. Okay, got you.
yeah, so the mind in the sense that classically is used as a dualistic non-material phenomenon, and you're going to say that mind is a material phenomenon, then you lose the ability for the governing principle of mind. Because say, okay, that mind is a product of brain, and so the idea in your head or my head is a product of our brain. That means that the idea is not universal. It's just a product of an individual brain. So you still can't have a science of philosophy. It becomes eliminativistic. So you could have a science of philosophy. You could have a philosophy of science because the mind that contemplates science is from a different non-material realm that science deals with. Is where the science of philosophy would be impossible because it would be eliminativistic. That science would eliminate science, would eliminate philosophy. It wouldn't. You wouldn't have a science of philosophy. You would have the science elimination of philosophy, just like consciousness. You have a science of consciousness. You have the scientific elimination of consciousness.
Okay.
You don't really only have a science of consciousness if you're a dualist.
Well, if everything is consciousness, isn't that monism?
Well, I mean, really, it's spiritual liminalism. So you're eliminating the material realm as opposed to the scientific or atheistic elimination of the spiritual realm. You're eliminativist in the opposite direction, where you're eliminating the material realm.
I'm saying material is a limit of cosmic, I guess, or of
I mean,
consciousness.
you're an eliminativist in the opposite direction,
Yeah.
where you're eliminating the material realm as opposed to eliminating the spiritual realm.
It's the only way to be able to inherit the metaphysics that I want. So,
So, I mean, as opposed to just dualism. There's two realms, and there might be governing factor, or but so the main direction
I think the
is
coherence of language is grounded in dualism. So I'm not like anti-dualism or anything like that. I do think it's necessary to. I call myself a qualified non-dualist more than an absolute non-dualist.
yeah, but I'm saying you're eliminativist in the opposite direction, where you're eliminating the material realm.
No, it's emergent from consciousness, though.
Yeah, but that's still eliminativist.
It's not though, because obviously we need materialism to ground coherence because the periodic table is material. That's what I'm saying. Like, we need some type of materialism to ground coherence. We always did, because non-dualism is, like you said, it's non-dual. That's the problem when everything we recognize is dualistic.
So I mean, if you're true and like monist, where you're saying that if you're going to say that consciousness is the origin of both the material and the spiritual realm, that consciousness is not the spiritual realm, but it's the origin of both the material and the spiritual realm. And what you're going to define as the spiritual realm is not consciousness, as a derivative of consciousness. That would be like a pure monism. But if you're saying that consciousness is the spiritual realm and materialism is emergent from consciousness, then you're not a monist. You're just you're I mean you're a monist in terms of saying the only thing that exists is the spiritual realm. You're saying the opposite of what T Jump and JF are saying, that consciousness is an emergent property of the material realm. You're saying that the material realm is emergent quality, but that's not monistic in the classical sense. That if you're going to say that the monistic precursor to both the material and spiritual realm is consciousness, then you have to define the spiritual realm as something that has a different function that's not consciousness.
Why?
I mean, this is just a classical definition. So I mean, if you're monistic, like there's the forms, and the forms are the precursor to the material and the spiritual realm.
Okay.
The forms are not an element of the spiritual realm. They're precursor. Or if you're a deist, like a monistic deist, where you're saying that the deity is the precursor to the spiritual and the material realm. So the deity is not the material realm or the spiritual realm, it's the ruler and origin of both of them.
Sure.
And the deity is something different than the spiritual realm. Um, so that's the confusion between, you're saying that what is the spiritual realm and what's the difference. So if you're just saying that there's consciousness, so you're saying you're a dualist, and the non-material realm is that when you refer to the non-material realm, when you use the word consciousness, you're referring to the other non-material realm. Or
Are you asking me? Because honestly, when I chose
asking,
that
or you're saying that
definition for
consciousness is
consciousness,
something different than consciousness is the precursor to the non-material realm, but it's not the material realm.
I
It's not.
propose a
It's
definition based on what would be maximally in line with what exists as a corpus in quantum mechanics right now, but that would also be consistent with what we're calling our own state of subjective consciousness, which is waveform reduction, aka wave function collapse. My modified version of waveform reduction that doesn't violate the conservation of energy.
I mean, you're starting with yourself as opposed to logical principles.
It is a logical principle to begin in subjectively. That's how Ayurveda works. That's why it's endured for as long as it has.
I mean, Ayurveda, but I mean, I'm just talking pure metaphysics. That you have, monism versus dualism, where you have an originating, you have classically two realms of material and a spiritual realm. And so if you're using the word consciousness and you're saying is that what is classically understood to be the spiritual realm or not? And if
I
you're
don't know where the spiritual realm, where that line would be drawn. There's a lot of different understandings. I chose the definition based on that. It was very good luck in a way that there was an existing definition that already accorded with something that was recognizable. In terms of like what you're asking, I don't know if I actually have an opinion because I don't look at it like that, but I would say the strongest argument against what you're saying is Well, it's just one thing. We simulate that ordering principle that's intrinsic as separate because we're dualistic beings ourselves. The substrate is itself non-dualistic, and we should
Stop
seek
talking
to
about
emulate
yourself.
the
I'm
substrate.
talking about the pure conceptualization. It has nothing to do with me or you.
Well, what do you mean? I mean, consciousness, of course, has to do with people.
No, we're talking about just the basic derivative principles that yes would be definitive of me and you, but it doesn't. You don't need to talk about yourself to talk about these concepts. They were talking about that. Okay, there's a me, and that I would have a soul and a mind that may be material or spiritual. But it's talking about definitionally where you have two realms, a material realm and a spiritual realm. And it has nothing to do with your consciousness or my consciousness. Talking about consciousness in general. So if you're saying that if there's a material realm and then there's another realm, is consciousness part of that other realm, or is consciousness the other realm? Or you're saying that consciousness is in is the originator of both realms, and answer the question without talking about yourself.
Matter has the property of consciousness if consciousness is the property of flux or change. Matter it's basically the same thing as the quantum superposition. It's the idea that there's vibration intrinsic in matter. That's
But
what
what are
that's
the
really saying.
origins of you're introducing new terms. So what are the origins? So if you're talking about materialistic governing rules, what realm do these exist in?
Well,
And so if
that's
you're
a
saying
matter
they
entire
exist in
that's
the
an
realm
ontological
of
matter, obviously.
consciousness, so I mean, don't talk about yourself. So you're talking about flux or these governing principles, and they're largely irrelevant. So you're saying there's governing principles. What realm do these principles exist in?
What realm do the principles
Do the
exist?
governing principles exist in?
If the principles don't change, then they exist in they cannot exist in matter, which is subject to constant change. So they would be outside of the realm undergoing constant change, which is commonly referenced as material, therefore supermaterial, or what we'd like to call dualistic. How many levels, that's a matter of ontology. That's what I meant.
Yeah, so so you're
Rick
and
says we're
so
talking past each other
where
because we
does
don't have a foundational definition of consciousness, Rick. I can guarantee you that's not why. Doovid understands my stuff more than probably anyone else out there.
I
So
mean, where
yes,
does
sorry, go ahead.
consciousness fit in? You're saying consciousness is in relation to the governing rules. Do the governing rules necessitate consciousness? Do the governing rules operate independently of consciousness?
I would say that given that this is my own opinion, there is one physical law, and that's the law of consciousness. That's as close as I could really get to
So you're
like
saying the
saying
governing rules
that
and consciousness are one and the same?
if we take the definition of consciousness as motion, then yeah, you can say materialism is subject to constant motion. That's basically what that would be saying. That's like my version of quote panpsychism, where matter itself has the property of consciousness, but consciousness is the changing. So the things that don't change, like a chair, wouldn't be conscious. Why can't a chair be conscious? Definitionally, it doesn't change. Our access to the chair may change over time. Chairs maybe get better over time, worse, whatever. Um, but it, as the thing, is atemporal. So it wouldn't be conscious for that reason. It's definitionally. And that definition of consciousness is what allows for there not to be any problems like boundary condition problems, that arise in a lot of systems. I don't know. I'm hoping that's coherent, but I'm basically saying like it's not really that coherent to me either. I just went with what was already there. Because to just come up with something new and to say, "Oh, this is what consciousness is," well, it's like, if there's no basis to it, like, it's just completely unrelatable, and especially, like, I think my theories are super obvious, but obviously a lot of people don't agree, like the quantum periodic table and such.
Yeah, so if you have a non-deistic system, but I mean, if you clearly delineate, there's
I'm trying to say that matter is
what
still,
are governing
um,
rules?
under
What's the difference
governed by a
between
mind.
governing rules and consciousness?
Um, Great question.
You're saying there is no difference that you could translate, or you're saying that conscious governing rules are a
You could
subset
say,
of consciousness, or are you saying that the material realm is governed by governing rules, and the governing rules are governed by consciousness?
I would say that there's one rule and it's consciousness, but that fact isn't coherent to us, and what is coherent is that there's that 4 laws of physics. So even
We're
though
saying
that all the
derivative, that
laws of
there's
physics.
only one rule. We're saying there's derivative rules of those rules, and those derivative rules, the governing rules that govern the material realm, are all consciousness, but they're one or they're many. And if they're derivative, are they part of the same realm? And then you have the question of the system. Is the system, uh, so if you're going to have consciousness as a set of governing rules that include all of the governing rules of the material realm,
No, it's motion itself. It's motion itself.
and then you say, and more, that if the set of consciousness that includes the governing rules of the material realm includes more rules than that are governing rules for non-material properties.
I mean, I think now that I hear you go into this much detail, like, I guess in that sense, there is dualism in my system on a very fundamental level because consciousness can be derived as a combination of moving and non-moving parts.
And then if you're a non-deistic dualist, or if you're a theistic dualist, where the so to say I mean, the classical term now, the spiritual realm, but the non-material governing realm that includes the governing rules of the material realm, uh, has a mediating deity or not. So, I mean, you could be a non-deistic, like if you possibly like Shankaracharya, like a non-deistic dualist.
Why would he be non-deistic?
Well, that's what I'm saying, that your
Sorry, it just
system
makes no
appears to
sense.
be your system appears to be non-dualistic. Like you're just
Right.
saying karma is the governing factor, and you like God is karma is
I'm
basically what you're
saying
saying.
that karma in English, we should translate that to cause and effect, and we shouldn't take, uh, people who don't really understand that very well, who've misconstrued it as superstition to be the definition of a term that, when it actually meant something, was a grounding principle for physics.
Yeah, I was saying if you say that there's a deity that's outside of cause and effect, that'd be theistic dualism. You're saying there is no deity that's outside of cause and effect. There is just cause and
Well,
effect.
wait, it depends how we define cause and effect. Because if the deity is the controller of the cause and effect, then doesn't that solve the problem?
I mean, definitionally saying, can the controller of cause and effect be bounded by cause and effect?
It would be bounded by something different than cause and effect. It's just like, this sentence is a lie. It's like, it's not true, but it's hard to put into words, but like there's information, it's just like not in the actual words. I feel like that explanation wasn't very good.
Yeah, I mean, you should stick with just the pure abstractions, because all examples are generally going to be material examples, are not going to be illustrated. 'Cause we're talking pure abstractions, and that's why don't talk about yourself. Don't talk about examples. because we're talking about abstractions that parables won't really be useful.
Well, you understand in my tradition that we don't see it that way. We consider metaphors to be a thing that instantiates authority.
Yeah, but I don't want to hear about concepts. I don't want to hear about you. And so you can't separate the concepts or the abstractions from yourself. Like every single thing, it has to be about you and talking about yourself.
Because I brought up consciousness, I'm not sure where that's coming from, but okay. I guess we can go on with the.
And we're talking about levels of abstraction, and so we're talking about the material realm, the governing rules of the material realm, and then the non-material realm that includes the governing rules of the material realm, and then some higher force that is beyond the governing rules of the material realm. And so talking about yourself or some sort of metaphor in the material realm is unuseful to the topic at hand. We're trying to get past the material realm.
And the question is consciousness past the material realm or not? Isn't it? And that was sort of the point with the debate we were discussing, is that, I mean, frankly, like, the only way I could see the atheists taking the position that they're taking is if they said, well, we can ground physics and consciousness would be included somehow in that, without God. Which I think is kind of what they're saying. Like, they're, not sure if they'd agree that, like, logic and rationality replaces or fills the same gap that God left, I guess, so to speak.
If
Not really
they
sure.
hit them with like either or yes or no questions, like, is logic governing and binding, and what's the origins of logic, or just so if you I'm using the generalization of higher order rules, that if you hit the materials, what is the origin of governing higher order rules? Are they binding, consistent, and coherent throughout the entire material realm? And what is the origin or source or power behind these governing rules? And
Sure.
and say that the theistic model, that these governing rules govern from a separate realm. They don't govern from the realm that they're in, they govern from a separate realm. And that's why the theistic framing of science is more powerful than a materialistic, atheistic framing, because atheism would necessitate that these governing rules exist and they're a product of the realm that they exist in, and they govern from the realm they exist in.
Sure.
And I mean, that's the guy kind of made that argument from Kant, but then it was confused. I mean, he didn't clarify that, because he put it in the, just like this term God, and I don't think he would clarify that, like, you have to express it in dualistic terms, and just like your own confusion, are you a dualist? Do these realms, where do
I
these rules?
understand that dualism is a method, and I am a non-dualist fundamentally, methodologically, but I invoke dualism out of necessity frequently in my reasoning process because it's necessary to ground certain types of coherence, possibly all coherence. So dualism, I
It
would
didn't
say,
even
is
make any sense. You're
necessary
saying
for science.
you're not a dualist, but you're a dualist because your system's not coherent.
No, I'm saying that
You wanna
dualism,
not be a
to make
dualist, but you have to
dualism
be
a
a dualist.
facet of any level, to implement dualism on any level of reasoning leads to problems. So you want dualism there as something that comes in sequentially from non-dualism to monism to dualism. And you wouldn't always have, for example, consciousness. There's not really any dualism with consciousness per se, because everything is subject in materialism to ongoing change. If we're defining consciousness as equal to change, then matter is itself conscious. So not
No, I
everything
mean,
is constantly changing.
that's your own idea that's not in, in line with the majority of consciousness theories. That are saying that even your definite like, for that, like, consciousness is completely unnecessary. Like, you're just saying change, motion, and
For,
to define that as consciousness is,
I
on
don't have to. I'm just saying that if you want other stuff that's been written in the past to make sense, then that's the way to look at it. I would say you could model it as change. I would sooner model it as um, volume,
yeah, I mean,
vibrating
you're largely
volume,
being nonsensical. That why you refer to that as consciousness is basically nonsensical.
because English has the word consciousness in it, and we agree that themselves are conscious. They may not agree as to what that means, but they agree on that. And so I'm saying, well, if you define it this specific way, then it'll be consistent with matter, the property of matter that we're calling conscious also. So we're animated by things that
But
don't change.
when someone refers to them, there's basically no connection with motion. Consciousness
Really?
referring to the I, the controller, and I, the experiencer.
Yeah, you're going through the motions of experiencing. I mean, don't you need some level of motion to render an experience?
Not necessarily that, I mean, if you need like time flowing or motion, say not necessarily. There's an I that is the controller and the experiencer, and I mean, you could argue that you don't even need motion or time flowing for that. Even if time wasn't flowing, that there could still be an I that was the controller and the experiencer.
Um, that would be nonsensical according to most people's views, which are that temporal causality grounds coherence.
No, I mean, you're adding
Most
this
people have
motion thing in. I mean, you're creating a unique system, and then you're redefining words in a way that doesn't match their regular one. So you could be as
it doesn't
eliminative.
not match it. It's just
If
more
you're saying
specific than usual.
you're
It doesn't
essentially
not
as
match it.
eliminative.
It's just more specific.
I
That's
don't
all.
even know if you're being more specific.
I'm definitely being more specific because right now the model is saying that it's brain emergent, which is incoherent. It's a reification fallacy.
Well, it's just one model. So like no, the main model is you classically is dualism, and it doesn't
Sure.
have anything to do with motion. I mean, it might be connect motion
Well,
adjacent
do
or
you think
connected,
that Leibniz would
but
have
the I
described
is the
himself as a dualist? And I'm sure he would have ascribed his success to God.
well, but yeah, but what's that have to do with anything? You're talking about your system in motion, just like when you use the word consciousness.
I was specifically
Um,
pointing to calculus as being pretty much about motion. And so it's not unprecedented for someone to point to motion as a facet of things. I may be the first person to say consciousness is motion itself. You can also say is vibration itself. It's just a question of what's the best word to use. And there you go.
yeah, I think, I mean, by in essence, you're being an eliminativist.
Every ontology slash metaphysics is its own brand of eliminativism because you can analogize them as languages. Just say, well, yeah, every language sort of is a little different and can't quite express the exact same range of concepts. Like, yeah, there's some
So then
overlap,
consciousness
obviously.
becomes unnecessary. If you're defining consciousness as motion, then consciousness itself is unnecessary, just using the word motion.
I could do that.
If consciousness is a derivative of motion.
No, motion is a derivative of forms, but they're technically co-arising, right? Which is where you recover the non-dualism.
Yeah, I'm assuming it's not being precise in your language or purposely confusing. Because if you're using the word consciousness in a non-traditional definition form, just use and you're saying really what you mean is motion, just use the word motion.
Because it only applies to motion on the level of a waveform.
Yeah, but why? I mean, so why even use the word consciousness?
Because consciousness is when the waveform is subject to motion. When the waveform is undergoing motion, it's not consciousness.
Is if there's no motion, there's no consciousness.
The waveform is undergoing. Okay, you know how the velocities are the same in all the reference frames? You need acceleration from. It's kind of the same idea. Like consciousness is only
I
a
say
measure
a
of its
simple
own
question:
thing.
if there's no motion, there's no consciousness.
They're not equal in the sense that all forms of motion can be equated. Think of it like how when you're measuring, the difference between observation, which is
I'm not asking you to give
inferential, and
me.
quantum
Stop giving
mechanics.
parables. Stop giving parables and examples.
There's literally only one example. It's interferential
Because
measurement
that's a
versus
simple question. You're
versus
saying that.
measurement.
I mean, from a dualistic perspective, it was like simple. Like motion is a phenomenon of the material realm, not the spiritual realm. Consciousness is not dependent on motion.
Consciousness is not dependent on motion.
Consciousness is motion is a so to say is a material phenomenon, not a spiritual phenomenon, and consciousness is not bound by material phenomenon such as motion. And even the question, what
Motion is emergent from consciousness.
in the spiritual realm, is there such a thing as motion?
And that would depend on ontology. So we have to say, yes, we're going to allow for motion to be defined spiritually, or no, we're not. So I would say it's very reductionist to not allow any motion in a supermaterial sense, because then you're saying that photons and fermions are identical in category and ought not be separated, which is a bit silly. And so I just wouldn't do that. Even
Yeah,
if
I
it
mean, you're the
eventually
one.
come down to that.
You're the one that's mixing up your terminology. That it just makes it unclear. So if you mean consciousness to be the spiritual realm, that you're using the word consciousness to mean in totality what's classically meant as the spiritual realm, um, or whatever your definitions. I mean, they're unclear, and they're unclear because
Different systems
because you're
define
using words
spiritual realms differently. I don't want to speak for other
their
systems.
classical
I don't know how they
definitions.
define it. How am I supposed to know how other systems define something as abstract as a spiritual realm?
I mean, do your research, do your homework.
And it's going to come out of me understanding their framework on dualism, presumably?
Well,
Then that's presupposing that their framework on dualism predicts their logic. Huge leap there.
well, I'm saying logic is a motionless system. Logic doesn't exist in the material
Logic
realm.
is
It's not.
structure of deduction.
Yeah, I'm saying it's not affected by motion. There's no motion in logic.
Logic has intrinsic motion because it takes you from suppositions to conclusions. And the motion is that process of going through it. It's the same in math. There's motion in math when you're doing any change to a graph. Even a graph itself represents change in a possible position of something.
I mean, the graph is the material representation of the.
The graph is not material. The graph is pointing at something extra material, aka the superposition state, aka the distribution, or the y equals x, or the graph, or whatever the hell you want to call it. I think this particular definition works because it makes it necessary to distinguish multiple levels of consciousness, which makes sense. If everything's conscious, aka everything is vibrating, everything's subject to motion of vibration. If that's a fact, well, we should probably not deny it as a fact. So not all motion is vibration motion.
You're sky daddy, like okay.
Not all
It
motion
can't
is
be
vibration
explained physical,
motion.
therefore sky daddy, and as opposed to having some sort of consistent, coherent metaphysics of non-material phenomenon.
Right. So
And then so you just throw
there
around
is no
terminology
consistent
that
coherent metaphysics
becomes
of that.
nonsensical. because like it's like, oh, like when you say consciousness or all these things, you just mean Sky Daddy, or are you actually trying to?
Well, you sounds like you're denying that you're conscious, and it's like, if you want to deny that you're conscious, fine, but I wouldn't do that.
Well, I'm just trying to clearly define these terms.
Yeah.
You're saying, what is the
And
I? What is the
what
I
is
that's
the I is an extremely derivative concept. And we have no reason to think that that ought to have any bearing on anything. So the question is, what is it that we intuit subjectively that has correspondence to actual metaphysical primitives? And taking from that argument about the single ontological type, single irreducible ontological type, if that's all there is, and the least action principle predicts that that's all there is, well, that's not intelligible to us because we identify meaning based on contrast. And if there's a single thing, there's no contrast in there. Dualism, non-dualism, sorry, is pre-contrast, and monism is not quite contrast, but it's like a framing of some sort. You couldn't even say there's contrast under monism. You need really fundamentally dualism to have contrast, if that helps. And that's basically what my argument is, saying that I can say that there's only one law of physics, and that's the law of consciousness, but it's essentially meaningless to say that because it's saying the thing that it's in our language, but it's not in our way of understanding language, which is contrast oriented. So thank you for your patience in my plodding my way through expressing these rather tricky and subtle concepts. Daryl asks how I make the leap between motion and conscience. So I haven't talked about conscience yet. I'm assuming you mean consciousness. I'm talking about the fact that we're rendering an external experience. Why is that happening? And it's because of vibration in our waveform, which is light. And consciousness on the level of matter is alteration in either its photons, which is chemistry, or electrodynamics if we're just looking at single electrons and whatnot. So yeah, I really enjoyed that debate, though. I have to say, like, I wish I had seen the theists make a bit stronger arguments. Like, I think the fact that there's no abiogenesis model is actually quite a hit against atheism. What do you think, Doovid? Ought science have an abiogenesis model?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, any like just to go over a long list of questions where science doesn't have sufficient explanations. Um, I'm not sure if it made the point because it's saying like, okay, that doesn't mean that there's a God just because the current level, so to say, of science can't explain these phenomena.
Could be part of an argument for a god. I don't think that. Oh well,
And
I
I think
actually
even if
that's why I'm
science could
impressed
explain
because
these
the guy.
phenomena,
I was impressed that he actually
put
made
it from
the
the
argument.
perspective that even if science could explain all of these phenomenon, you still logically necessitate a spiritual mediating realm and theism. So if they're basing their argument because science can't explain these things, therefore God, it was saying I want to make a stronger argument that even if science could explain these things, you still would need God.
And then you'd want to say that because maybe some type of morality thing, because consciousness is outside of secular science and morality is in the domain of, or in the purview of consciousness.
Yeah, I mean, because in that you're making the framing that science doesn't exist, the scientific ideas don't exist in the material realm. So even if scientific
Scientific
ideas
ideas
could
don't exist in
explain,
the material realm. Well, like, yeah, and then we could say like only space time really exists in the material realm.
well, and matter and material,
That is what
you could
matter is.
you could argue that space and time are also non-material phenomena.
Well, they're observed in matter, though. I mean, that's what I'm saying. We don't have any evidence for anything other than space and time being material and space-time. I mean, that's the whole
I
argument.
mean that's the it's the ether concept. But you're saying that they're observed, in space and time, but to say that the space and time that they're observed in are material is not clear. Saying the material that's observed within space and time are material, but the space and time itself being material is unclear.
Is space-time material? Yes, that's special relativity, pretty much.
No, that's not. I mean, it might be interpretation of it.
Well, then you're into a definition about what is matter, aren't you? And then
We even question what matter
just
is. By saying
debate.
is saying that the substrate that matter exists in, namely being, you say the 3+1 dimensions, the space time, that substrate of space time is non-material. That the material forms exist in a non-material substrate.
I guess that would be the quantum fields.
The empty space is
quantum fields
empty
thing?
space is non-material. That the matter in that matter
material.
that's in space is material, but empty space itself is not material.
Well, most of matter is empty space, though. So now you're taking a completely unorthodox definition of matter.
When we clearly define matter, no, you're saying that matter is whatever matter is, it exists in the substrate of space-time, and space nor time are material.
Well, what's material if not space and time?
Well, material is material matter.
And what's matter then? You can't just say matter is matter. You got to point to something and say, well, I mean, when I think matter, I think the elements. And when I think the elements, I think space-time because that's what my model says.
Well, I'm saying that the elements, that the whatever the most basic forms of matters are, they exist in a substrate, and that substrate is space and time, but that substrate they exist in is not material.
Yeah, Daryl says matter is that which has mass. Mass generates space and time. So space and time are the observables of matter and space-time.
Well, I mean, he's postulating that mass generates
It's
space.
definitional. It's definitional. He's not saying that, but I am, and it's definitional. I mean, we don't, that's, the question is, how do we account for concepts that are atemporal? How do we account for chairs? So the argument is either give the parameters, the space-temporal parameters. I'm not saying this is your job. It's like what philosophy is set up. It's like give the space-temporal parameters of a chair, or concede that chairs don't exist. So it's like, I want a third option, please. But yeah, this is a super important conversation. And I thought
it was kind of basic metaphysics even.
Metaphysics is extremely hard to talk about. So even basic metaphysics, to have a conversation about it is quite an achievement, I think. So I'm very happy.
Well, egoism, again, people, it's not really that difficult to talk about. It's saying people, like the separation of yourself from yourself. And if you say, okay, myself is non-material, so the me that's talking about these objects is not the material I.
The material I. Yep, Daryl's confirming what I said. Not to be a Daryl shill or anything, but he's right here. I thought T-Jump, when he said that induction was the basis of science, was a bit strange, because I would have thought it was deduction based on a model, and you deduce predictions from a model. So I think science is structurally abductive. It has both. The deduction is the meta-analysis, and then the induction is the generation of the hypothesis. And the problem with induction is you're presupposing your own metaphysics that definitionally you don't have access to the information content of said metaphysics, because they're operating on the level of like language processing, which we don't really have access to that cognitively. Did you have any thoughts on what Teach said about induction?
Um, not sure. Okay, you want to wrap up? You mentioned that article a few weeks that just pointing out that the so to say genetic evidence of the recreation of phylogenetic trees is turning out to be different than the classical evolutionary trees that based on um, taxonomy, ecology of how we created the I think I forget the terminology, but the
Basically, the current model is saying like the shape of the animal, that's something to look at as something that would suggest they're part of the same hereditary tree. Whereas this is saying, actually, we did some studies of their makeup in terms of the particular chemicals or whatever, atoms, elements their corpses were comprised of, and realized that that it appeared to point in that those correlations point in a different direction than what we have inferred from what I have called de-evolution, which is the domain-specific adaptation, which I believe is being incorrectly asserted on this macrological level, which encompasses far many more orders of magnitude of time than what we're talking about for what it takes to generate broccoli from brassica, for example. One of my oft-touted, I'm sure Doovid would qualify as far too cheesy metaphors. But yeah, I just
yeah.
thought
I
you'd be
mean,
interested in this because
I thought
Doovid
the
has
article
long
was saying
stood
that.
against evolution as a model.
Well, I mean the main methods of the phylogenetic trees of evolution were largely drawn out before the advent of genetics. So, how the geneticists determine evolutionary trees, looking at sequences and similar sequences between different organisms, and from there trying to determine the historical origin of species from genetic evidence, is turning out to be different than our classical phylogenetic trees, like you said that sapiens or the animal kingdom or the various things that the taxonomy, and a lot of it even goes back to the Greeks. Uh, but most of the taxonomical system, that's why most of it's in Latin. Um, versus if you tried to use the genetic evidence for the method that the genetic evolutionists use for determining these trees are turning out to be different. And I mean, it's not surprising. I'm not sure exactly, if what the article was saying, or if it's trying to make it, more impactful than not. But as the genetic, so to say, testing, better, the more knowledge, if you believe in the evolutionary processes and the indication of the genetic evidence that our current taxonomy phylogenetic trees appear to be incorrect. And maybe if you're in the pro-evolutionary school, then you have to you're gonna have conflicting pieces of evidence. So how strong is the genetic evidence? And if the genetic evidence points to a different taxonomical system of which animals are similar to which organisms are similar to which organisms, are we going to rework those the taxonomical system of the phylogenetic trees? So, I mean, that was what I got out of the article. It made sense. I hadn't thought too much out of it. And if you're an evolutionary biologist, it's probably a groundbreaking field because there's more and more gene sequencing, and from the more and more gene sequencing, the more and more organisms, they have their methodologies of trying to determine from that what they believe to be the origin of species, and that's going to conflict with the other information. And so do they just discard our previous taxonomal system, or is there some sort of method of conflicting sources of evidence?
Well, they
Versus
might
with
be able
someone
to
like me who
generate a
doesn't
model.
believe in evolution, how I would interpret this from a non-evolutionary perspective versus the from the article is the internal disputes within evolution.
Uh-huh. I just thought you'd be wanting to use that against evolution to say that it wasn't really a predictive model in the first place. And that doesn't really say anything. And it's not really a substitute for religion. And it's a bit silly for people to claim that. Especially to claim that brains came from evolution. That's really weird. Oh yeah, JF said coherence grounds knowledge. What the hell was that? I thought that was kind of weird. Just sort of seemed like it was
We've
asserted.
seen definitionally. I mean, coherence. You mean just higher ordering? What I'm calling governing principles or higher ordering rules. So there's ordering principles. These coherence. I thought that's just what he meant by it. And then he talked about knowledge. So there's general knowledge, and then scientific knowledge is bound by mathematics because predictions. Where you have knowledge, which is general coherence, but within science, it has to make predictions, and those predictions are in the realms of mathematics. That's a point I've mentioned, all the time with like engineering and having exact formulas that make predictions, that exact predictions, not just like anecdotal predictions, but mathematical predictions that could be precise.
Sure. It's unclear sometimes what a mathematical prediction would consist of. It implies all predictions are mathematical, and it would appear to be not a fact.
What is it? I mean, saying generally, science is not science until it's expressed in the language of mathematics, because the only predictions that are only real predictions that have to be mathematical.
Uh-huh. That would appear to be not the case. So where did the brain come from? It's a prediction of consciousness being intrinsic, that there will be saturation points of consciousness. And that's what a brain is. It's a saturation point of consciousness, a resonator, if you will. The brain has no reason to exist if there's no consciousness that came before it. Because what the brain does is filters out. Not quite filtering, but more like rearranging the configuration of, in order to increase the amount of sensitivity into the sense organs fundamentally. Which would be obvious if we'd actually applied science to consciousness, but we didn't do that. So it's not obvious at all. So yeah, I was interested in, induction being the basis of science. That's not a fact. And when T-Jump said language is based on okay, he said that induction was a language and that language was based on logic, and that deduction is part of the structure of a language. And I was wondering if what he meant was that anytime someone was doing induction, that meant that like they were necessarily doing deduction also. And yeah, that was it. He said there was undiscovered physics that would answer all the questions. I think that's a faith assertion. So I think it's really hilarious how many faith assertions there really are coming out of the atheists. Oh yeah, and I didn't understand why you can't have an a priori synthetic. Why that's incoherent. Did you understand that?
Why what?
He said that T-Jump said a priori synthetic was incoherent. So that itself seemed completely nonsensical to me, but I don't know if you understood.
Yeah, I watched in 2 speed, and then I didn't even. I wasn't really following that closely. All the arguments. And like I'm sure the faith statement saying that the answers to these questions will be found in materialism. And I guess faith. Somebody's saying that okay, there's uncertainty, there's lots more questions than there's answers to. But that doesn't mean Sky Daddy. It just means that the answers aren't known yet, but presumably the answers will be ans- answered in materialistic terms. I don't even call that faith.
Well, yeah, I mean, isn't that what you're saying when you say numerical terms?
What do you think? Because there's unanswered questions, therefore Sky Daddy. You say no, there's unanswered questions, and the questions, if they have answers, or will eventually answer them, they'll be in materialistic terms, not through Sky Daddy. And just because there's unknowns, uh, doesn't mean God. It just means there's unknowns.
Are you saying that that's the atheist's argument, or that's your argument?
But it's atheist argument. I don't think that's a weak argument. Just saying, oh, because the atheists have to believe.
I think it's extremely weak. If it weren't for how weak the other side were, it's basically a question of who can ground coherence better.
Yeah, I mean,
Neither
I
side
think
can
it's I
ground
think it's
coherence
neutral. Just
shit.
that Sky Daddy doesn't you're just okay. There's unknowns. We don't have answers to all the questions, and that you're just believing that if you say, "I believe that science will eventually answer these questions," versus saying, "It's possible that science may never answer these questions, but I still believe that the answers to these questions are in materialism, even if science or we never answer it." Versus Sky Daddy, that you just because there's unanswerable questions and science may never come up with a solution doesn't mean Sky Daddy. So I don't think that the belief, just saying that oh, there's questions that you can't answer, therefore Sky Daddy. So I thought that was neutral, and I think that was a powerful argument.
You didn't think it was powerful. You thought it was neutral.
That, I mean, just the Jav's not allowed to believe. It's like, oh, there's unknowns, and so Jeff has beliefs about the unknowns that mainly that he believes that either the unknowns will eventually be known, or that even if the unknowns are permanently unknown to man, that the answer still is a material answer, not Sky Daddy. So I don't see that. I mean, I saw this in neutral. I don't think that just so what he believes. Therefore, what? Therefore, you're because Jay believes that it's okay that you believe in non-material answers. Or people like Sky Daddy, and I say that that's why I want the stronger form of the argument that even if science could explain all these phenomenons, it would still necessitate God, because that's whether you can have a philosophy of science, you can have a science of philosophy. Or to put it that there's certain questions that science will never answer. And theology will be able to answer those questions, and therefore science is framed within a theological perspective, because the philosophy of science clearly defines the limits of the abilities of science. So we have JF, we would say we could be delusional about the potential for science. Who's saying someone's grounded in the philosophy of science and theology knows the limits and can say science will never provide us answers to these to certain questions. That there is no discovery, there is nothing coming that it will in the realm of science that it's going to help clarify certain questions.
I thought it was weird when they got into the boundary conditions stuff. That didn't appear to be very sensible. And let's see here. Yeah, maybe that's.
Yeah, I didn't check that guy. Like, he's kept on saying, like, check his YouTube page. And I'm probably not going to check his YouTube page. Maybe if like he appears again at some point. But yeah, I mean, stuff is complicated. And that's why I say like if I were doing the debate, to try to express simple points or to clarify to the majority of the people, and then maybe it is a good strategy to just like, yeah, well, like check my YouTube page.
Cool. All right. Well, I guess we can wrap it up. Some great show. 3 hours and 20 minutes. Pretty long for almost no material, but I just really enjoyed going over that. Very particular and important, highly subtle question.
Okay, so if you want to keep on rambling, feel free. I'll check it out tomorrow. Have a great week, everybody. Thanks for reading the HIMSA article.
Oh, yeah, that was
And
awesome.
yeah, I think the debate was a good start. Get some of these more questions in the open, get people thinking about it, and hopefully people will start thinking about you know, dualism. So what does it mean to have non-material properties, or a separate realm? And just use the word like science, a scientific approach to spirituality, which really I don't mean I mean a logical approach to spirituality. And then if like look at it, well, logic is a derivative of the spiritual realm anyway, so it's unnecessary to say logical approach to spirituality, because logic is a derivative of spirituality in the first place. But just thinking about it, what is there a non-material realm, and what factors are objects of this non-material realm? And then to clearly define terms, what do we mean by consciousness, what do we mean by governing principles? And so not just this kind of like vague, like there's material, and then everything non-material is like God, or consciousness, or spiritual, but to have more clearly defined working definitions of non-material spiritual processes.
Do you think that's even possible?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's like the HIMSA article I wrote,
Okay.
and like the Jain system, and that there's uh, Kabbalistic Vedic systems of that clearly define the working principles of the spiritual realm. And then if you say that the mind is an object of the spiritual realm, that is an observer, that you could observe the spiritual realm through your mind, and using what when you're so the sense perceptions observe the material realm, but the mind itself observes the spiritual realm, and from there you could understand spiritual processes through the power of mind. And
Great.
that's really at the heart of Vedic Kabbalistic wisdom.
Awesome. Well, I guess we'll see you next Sunday, if not sooner, and looking forward to the next one. Great show.
And even a deeper dive into karma, saying what
Sure.
factors are mediated in the non-material realm. So, okay, like, okay, there's the tree falls in the forest and no one hears it. If someone does a good or bad deed, it leaves an imprint in the non-material realm. And that doesn't just mean like Sky Daddy. There's systems of karma of how this stuff operates.
Well, Sky
Because
Daddy would just be definitional, somehow.
what he's saying, like karma, non-material realm, Sky Daddy. It's like, no, there's clear working understandings of how these processes work.
Well, the idea
Uh,
is that Sky Daddy wrote the laws of karma.
yeah, and they're just saying that um, the behave the how we observe material phenomenon and how we observe spiritual phenomenon are different, because the spiritual phenomena are observed through mind, as you say, at least in the terminology, material phenomenon might be observed through mind, but they're mind independent, as opposed to spiritual phenomenon are, you could also, I mean, it's possible that you could define them as mind independent also, but they're observed through mind. And but it doesn't mean they can't be classified and structured in the same way as material laws, like karmatic laws. And saying you read the Vedas, karmatic laws are very well defined and structured. They just can't be measured in the same way as material scientific laws. Okay, yeah, great. Have a great week and
Awesome.
blessings. Hopefully, I'll pump out an essay this week. Probably, it sounds like the Kabbalah chess.
Congratulations again about getting so many views. That's just wonderful.
So I'm up to 6120, so slowing
Woohoo!
down, but even just in the last few hours, another 25 views. Okay, so have a great week.
Awesome. You too. Thanks everyone for joining. Daryl says science doesn't seek to prove things. Science, I've said this several times, science can only disprove things. So if you can only disprove things, then a proof is going to consist of, well, there's not really any such thing as a proof. But if there is, then it's something that hasn't been disproven for a very long time. The problem is that, uh, metaphysics isn't falsifiable through the process of science, at least not necessarily. I think it could be, but one would have to then understand how the numbers one attaches to their measurement is affected by the measurement itself, which isn't as really not anywhere near as cut and dry as it appears to be. Like even just identifying the problem, you don't really get a solution in terms of the problem. You get a solutions that don't sort of run afoul of the limitations that the problem imposes. Sort of like, well, we know what these limitations are. Let's sidestep them. You want to call that God of the gaps? You can, but I would just say it's like, how about just not falling into a trap that's been fallen into so many times because it's a well-known erroneous sense perception. Why insist on learning the hard way? So, yeah, I do think that you could set up some type of a scientific philosophy, which would be least action principle, but it would be, it wouldn't be particularly easy to use because one's ability to use it would be limited on their like knowledge of a notion that has no real self-evident direct correspondence in conventional language. Again, intuition here because of contrast facet of conventional truths, whereas non-contrast is the expected value of conventional truth. So with that, I'll put the link in the comments there for Rick who wants to come on for the like 0.1% chance that's not a troll. We'll let you know next.